And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, a candy-colored clown they call the Sandman, tiptoes through my room every night. Just to sprinkle stardust, and he whispers, "Go to sleep. Everything will be all right." We lost a big one there with David Lynch. Fantastic director, and really, I have to say his movies over time, you know, they don't get dated. They're actually more potent now than they ever were. And it says something about allowing that artistry to come in and really for people to go outside the box and not just make these endless versions of Wolverine movies and X-Men, you know, sequel after sequel. This is a guy who really brought something to the culture, and his movies were fantastic. And he died at 78. We lost him, but the movies are there, and he had a great sense of cinema. And I have to say, probably Blue Velvet was my favorite of his movies, but the Twin Peaks series and all the deep mystical things in Twin Peaks and all the Steiner theosophy and UFO stuff in there that's just right under the surface. Very, very interesting. Mulholland Drive, just so many movies, Eraserhead, The Elephant Man, incredible work. And so we salute you, Mr. Lynch, indeed. And we have a very special episode for you tonight here. This is X Series 185. And you guys are spoiled because we're going to do some interviews and special reports and then come back with the X Series in February. But no, something very special happened along the way through the figure of Alex Jones. And Alex got a guest on who was the grandson of Billy Celestes, named Shane Stevens, a very upstanding, straight-ahead guy who had been passed down these family heirlooms of tapes. And the tapes tell us a great deal. Of course, Billy Celestes right in the heart of the LBJ scandals while he was VP before the assassination. And the tapestry in the background, as I looked into it, of course, you know, I've been aware of the whole Mac Wallace story for decades. And the Mac Wallace story is, you know, there was a fingerprint up there in the Texas School Book Depository. And after they went through all the different people looking for fingerprints of what had gone on there, they could identify everyone's fingerprints, including the women that worked there and dealt with the boxes and things. And there was just one unidentified fingerprint. And it's very interesting because the fingerprint, in fact, had languished. There was a JFK researcher who was working off a hunch based on a 1964 book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon. Yeah, it's 1964. And this guy had mentioned something about Lyndon's close relationship with a hitman, convicted murderer named Mac Wallace. The more you go into Malcolm Wallace, the more mysterious he gets as a figure. But that story had been lingering there. And in 2003, a documentary series called The Men Who Killed Kennedy came out with their final edition. They had done episodes of that thing since 1988. It was a British production by Nigel Turner. Very, very edgy researcher, incredible work. And they actually ran it on the History Channel, which shows the difference in the times. And what was fascinating for me, as we get into this tonight, we're going to see that Nigel Turner actually revealed so much of this story so early on. And when that came out, not only did he end up in court, not only did they ban that video, and, you know, the people in the lawsuit were very interesting too. Bill Clinton, Gerald Ford, who hadn't passed away yet, former presidents, very interested in this. They did not want the secret about LBJ coming out, and it did come out very explosively in that series. There has been a contingent that has popped up after the fact, 10, 20 years after that original breakthrough, which is just try to spotlight that, you know, Lyndon killed JFK to get into power or whatever. And the apparatus involved in executive action is too big for just an individual who's a VP with their power networks. The entire operation of the assassination comes from the intelligence connection through the aerospace companies. Is something we've showed in our own documentaries here, like Blue, like the Apotheum UFO file, and like the most recent one, JFK, the final speech. So, but it is very important to see how LBJ's role played into all this. And of course, he was aware of the assassination and was part of the tapestry of the entire coup that took place in 1963. This is the real danger of the whole piece that came out here through Shane Stevens, who had the bravery to bring these tapes forward on the Alex Jones show. Now, it's interesting with Stevens. He's a dentist. He runs a dental company, and he kind of didn't want to get mixed up in this, but he wants to kind of improve the family's standing as, you know, this kind of Christians that they are, and he didn't want this to hang out there. And it's interesting because the person who gave them to him was someone else that Billy Sol had entrusted to in the family and said, release these when the time is right. And the guy just was like, when is the time ever right for this? And so Stevens has had those tapes since 2016. He's been holding on to them for about 8 years, which is remarkable. And there's a very interesting saga around how the tapes, you know, when they were being digitized and things, how the company freaked out that was doing it. So we're going to get into all that tonight. It's very fascinating, and it goes right to the core of the aerospace intelligence connection directly to the JFK assassination. It is new evidence, and I have a transcript from the tape that I'll read tonight, along with some excerpts from Billy Sol's autobiography, which are very, very telling. And I'll go back to a murder that took place in 1961 of an agricultural official named Henry Marshall that threatened to explode all the corruption around LBJ. We're going to get into all that tonight in this very special episode, Dark Journals X Series 185, JFK Coup, CIA Aerospace Evidence Revealed. And 1963 to 2025, that's quite an arc of time, but we can see how the JFK assassination is locked and hovers over our entire process because of what took place there, and the cover-up and the amount of corruption required for the cover-up made, you know, American society duplicitous or dual in a sense, which was there's the real thing in the background, and we had this kind of facade on top, which occasionally would be flipped out by this deeper situation, this parallel government that was operating. And I think, you know, really Professor Peter Dale Scott put it best with his term, the deep state, understanding what the deep state is. And I see that that gets misconstrued a lot too. So I'm going to go back to some of these original things because we've had so many interviews with Professor Scott, and I've had so many conversations with him where he's clarified what he was talking about. And I think what happened after a while is the term deep state got bandied about so much that people just assumed it was like, you know, it's almost like having employees at the DMV who had stayed too long in government. Like, oh, these bureaucrats hung on to their jobs too long. And that's nothing to do with that at all, in fact. But it has to do with the intelligence structure, how it worked with organized crime on one hand, and drug running and things of this nature, and then the financial interplay of things like oil companies and big tech companies with that, and then that larger overlay of extreme and secret economic wealth, and then the contracting agencies around the intelligence companies. And it's very interesting that something has just come out about Booz Allen Hamilton and this whistleblower that well, actually, he's the whistleblower in this case. He sent someone in to do one of those Veritas-type videos that he does, and now he's on his own, and he's still doing it. And a long story short, there was a person there who was from Booz Allen Hamilton who had arranged these meetings in a skiff with these different retired generals to talk about what they could do about this Trump issue if he gets out of hand, you know. Last time I heard, that's coup talk. And I exposed that kind of thing again in 2020 when they were talking about what they might do against Trump in the waning days of his first administration. Very, very interesting. And the Trump inauguration slated for Monday. This should be amazing, a huge change, quite at the switchover. But this is remarkable too because they moved it indoors, and in my opinion, they did that specifically due to the drone threat that was going on, and that we've been seeing with this out-of-hand drone activity. And drones don't have anything to do with the UFO file unless you're utilizing the technology and rolling it out in these ways. And it's very interesting because instead of taking the drone thing seriously, we've had a lot of problems getting the word out about what it is. The independent media is really, they screwed up really badly and said that, it was just public misidentifications of planes and things like that. And now they don't know how to double back on it. So they're letting these guests in to come in and say, oh, the drones are UFOs. No, you have UFOs, then you have the drones and who's operating them. We know what the technology is generally around the drones. And they represent a kind of advanced drone technology that may in fact be reverse engineered. But nonetheless, that breakaway technology, that X technology coming out in different ways is something that we're seeing more and more of. And the regular media walls it off, as we know. Now we have official reports, we have UFOs over the White House. And actually, we've got this, now the drone sightings over Long Island Airport spark concerns. This is a news story. And now only in the last 3 weeks, they've had 17 unidentified drone sightings over a major airport, right next to a major city. And the airport is home to the 106th Rescue Wing of the New York Air National Guard. And Trump has pledged answers and actually saying that by January 21st, he's going to release a report as president about what's going on with this. So something very, very strange in the middle of all this, but you've had very muddy reporting on it. We've tried to really give you the story on this, that it is a crisis and it's quite major, whatever it is that's happening there. But those drone sightings over Los Angeles, quite remarkable indeed. And what I would say probably is that we're looking at a completely unidentified phenomena. And, what you want to do in a situation like that is really hold the government to account for what they know about it. And so that's what Trump is promising to do. Let's see if he sticks with the record. The other thing that grabbed my eye is the New York Times tried to villainize RFK Jr. with, they got these memos and things that Kennedy sought to stop COVID vaccinations 6 months after rollout. Robert Kennedy Jr. petitioned the FDA to revoke authorization of the shots in May 2021 when they were in high demand and considered life-saving. It's quite interesting. And they sort of rolled out this bad shot of RFK Jr. But if anything, this is a badge of courage for him that he stood up against the rollout of the COVID op. So I don't know what they think they're going to get pushing that out there, but it is interesting nonetheless. So it's very interesting in the realm also of things that are going on, because with Trump coming in, we know the JFK records becomes a major factor in all this. So the release of this tape and the timing is just so interesting that, and some people have said, well, do you think, this is kind of a ruse to take some pressure off of the actual release of the CIA documents? And my answer is no, because the story, as I mentioned at the outset, it had already been rolling around. It had reached a kind of crescendo in 2003. It's just that this is evidence coming forward. And one of the interesting things about Billy Sol, as we get into him tonight, Billy Sol Estes, the Texas swindler, one of the biggest businessmen in Texas, worth over $500 million at one point in 1960.
Jesus.
And think about what that is now. How much money is that? Well, somebody has a good calculator out there. My guess would be it's about between $6 and $8 billion. But, in that period, to have that kind of money and influence is just remarkable. And he basically, in that situation, got so double-crossed by Lyndon, who let him out there to hang and really take the fall for so many of the crimes that were going on in the background there, that I think when he got out of prison, and I have some inside knowledge on this because, interestingly enough, a person who's also in this story is Douglas Caddy, the Watergate lawyer who has come on this program many times to talk about how Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. But he was Billy Sol's lawyer, and he's the one who took him before a grand jury to put him on record about the Kennedy assassination and LBJ's involvement in it. So there's all kinds of interesting moves in this episode as we get into it. Before we get started in earnest, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps you and I in touch around what is heavy-duty censorship that we've experienced here with the program. And you know, it's interesting to me because I feel like the topics that we cover, they just instantly downgrade it. It's just, you know, it's one of these kind of AI tricks. And the algorithm is just slated against the work that we do here. The best way for us to get around that is for you to be on that free newsletter list. And what that does is it keeps us in touch, and you will get a newsletter about once a week on Fridays, just letting you know about the amazing, and I mean amazing, episodes we have coming up for you. Brilliant interviews and remarkable X series, mind-blowing stuff. Those episodes coming up for you in 2025, along with documentaries. Of course, JFK, The Final Speech, which is the Antarctica UFO file documentary. That's our latest one. Absolutely unreal. And live events, which is something that we're working on for this year. All of that's in the newsletter. So take a moment, stand up and be counted. Sign up at darkjournalist.com for that. And also, we're going to take your questions in the second half of tonight's program. We'll go about 2 hours with you here tonight. And Miss Olivia is putting those together now. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Conrad says, looking forward to hearing DJ's take on the new audio of Billy Sol Estes and Clint Carter that Alex Jones dropped this week. The grandson mentioned in the Alex Jones interview that the other family members have more tapes. There must be a mad race to get those now.
Yeah, he said that he had 4 and that the most significant one that he had is out now. But I'll tell you something about Billy Sol and the crafty fox that he was. He made a series of tapes, which is one of the reasons he didn't end up an LBJ statistic like so many of LBJ's other business partners. So by having those in there, even when he went into prison, he, you know, there wasn't some report about, oh, you know, he died of an accidental cancer like Jack Ruby. No, this is somebody who knew how to stay alive, and he knew by making these tapes that that would be his dead man switch, and the ultimate dead man switch in his case. Now, I've been aware of tapes of Billy Sol Estes for a while, maybe about 15 years. So it is very interesting that these are coming out. And of course, I do think that there are more. In fact, I saw an interview on a local Texas station from 2017 with a former lawyer of his, if you can imagine this guy. And he said, oh yeah, you know, apparently he stashed these little packets with different lawyers. And I haven't even gone into what he left for me, but I'm going to go into it, you know. And I don't know if there was ever any follow-up with this guy. But there are people who hold their insurance in this way. I've often cited the story of a friend of mine who worked for the Kennedys. And she was a babysitter for them, and she accidentally knocked down a painting in one of their living rooms. And out of that painting, all of these documents came out. And they were, when she looked at them, they were all FBI documents tracking the movements of JFK as a senator running for president. So they had them, and I feel like there are a number of these things. I call them stealth archives. But in this case, they are built-in ways of moving, you know, and keeping that information around so that at some point, if it came up, if they needed it, you know, that insurance would be there. So we'll get into all that tonight as well. It's something I think to keep in mind. What do you got there?
Conrad also says, would like DJ's opinion on how Robert Caro could have missed this side of LBJ and also not run into the Aerospace connection. Is this why the last installment of the LBJ biography has not been released?
Well, Caro is just playing that for the establishment. There are some interesting things in his books anyway about the corruption factor. But in all 3 volumes of Caro's biographical work on LBJ, there's not one mention of Billy Sol Estes, which is ridiculous.
Wow.
And think about it. Sol Estes went to jail for the crimes of LBJ, basically, who they both participated. So for him to leave him out is absurd. What does that tell you? And it lets you know that that's just a sanctioned, publication, and it's not going to really deliver. It'll deliver a lot of things about, him personally. Oh, he would conduct, these meeting with aides while he was going to the bathroom, So but it still has a core of some interest. What's interesting about some of these, and I've said this before about PBS specials and things like that, that they just ride on the surface. They can move with very superficial terms about things. And I always think about the one where they were talking about JFK as a prankster, And I'm like, how about the fact that he was involved in a war with an unseen machine operating below the public surface, and that surface killed him? So I always found those things, they were just stayed within the lines. And then you'd always see at the end that they were funded by Exxon. Then it all made sense. Talk about him being a prankster. That's a good idea. But nonetheless, you can get good information even from superficial things. So Caro's work, I've never found him particularly compelling, but obviously he has a lot of those intimate details on Johnson, but he left the most important detail out, the very dangerous business liaison that turned into a murder liaison with the Sol Estes situation. Very, very fascinating indeed. A little bit about Billy Sol Estes. This is somebody who really, as I mentioned, by 1960 was worth over $500 million. He also was somebody who cultivated that power base. And one of the people that he was deeply involved with, along with LBJ, was somebody named D.H. Byrd. Now, D.H. Byrd, we've done documentaries that have included large segments of D.H. Byrd, but he was the owner of the Texas School Book Depository and the cousin of Admiral Byrd, the famous Antarctica explorer. And D.H., he was the one who funded all of those trips. So that's quite interesting as well. We've made a lot of emphasis around this because in order for the assassination to be pulled off, you needed a number of things in place in the location of where the distraction would be, where the bullets came from. The whole thing about the Texas School Book Depository in Oswald, you had to have that dialed in. And there are a lot of very uncanny and very strange things about that whole situation, which just seem like synchronicities on the surface, but you go a little bit deeper and we get quite a tapestry going on. There's been a number of JFK researchers over the years, and they went into certain things, Dealey Plaza, anti-Castro Cubans, the mafia, and things like that. They were looking for where the motivations were. And I think they did a good job on the level that they were at and what they were doing. The thing that was long left out of the conversation was this overhanging aerospace aspect. And I've also brought up the fact that when you get into the JFK assassination, you're surrounded by UFO influences. And that fingerprint of the UFO file in the assassination, if you leave it out, you're missing a big part of the picture, because the advanced technology equation in the Kennedy era is off the charts. And there's a lot of very deep indications going on that Kennedy's access and interest in the exotic technology edge is part of the overall problem that the deep state had with him, which is he wanted to know, his real hands on power in relation to this. He didn't want to be a functionary of this deeper state, which is why he opposed the CIA and others. And he thought, I don't know why they've been letting them get away with this and, running the world the way that they are and not checking in with the executive branch and what they're doing, but that's all going to change now. So we've been looking at, in his administration, 3 years of him battling to take that power back under the executive branch, and a big part of that is the UFO aspect. There's no question, as we've covered very many times in this program. So keep that in mind as we go along tonight. In the background, there is hovering this exotic technology part, and I'll show you tonight because the person, after all, who is in the spotlight as a result of all these revelations from Billy Celeste's tapes is Mac Wallace. And Mac Wallace was an employee of LTV, Ling Tempco Vout. Ling Tempco Vout, experimental aerospace company, hardcore and owned and run by D.H. Byrd. So I have now all of these direct pieces of Wallace reporting to and interacting with D.H. Byrd. That's his boss, essentially. So now we've got Wallace and Byrd in the Texas School Book Depository sitting there in the middle of the assassination. What do you do with that? Well, we're going to walk through a little bit of the assassination and then the thing about the fingerprint. Then we're going to go to Mac Wallace. And then from there, we're going to take the Mac Wallace piece into the exotic technology piece. And what an explosion this tape represents. I have the transcript here. I'm going to read from some of that as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK Coup. CIA aerospace evidence, new evidence revealed, 1963, 2025. The aerospace part lingering there as the major backdrop in all this. And I feel like if you don't have that piece operating in the middle of all this, then we're not really getting what's happening. What do you got there?
I'm just curious. I never had a chance to watch that Alex Jones segment. So I'm wondering if you can start with that and then work your way back and around it.
Oh, of course. Well, we already have referenced it 3 times now.
No, I mean actually reading the transcript.
Oh, yes, I definitely will. I plan to. I have the transcript right here. I'm going to set up the piece about LBJ, so then we roll right into this. But absolutely. So Washington Post, the headline, the day after the assassination, someone was nice enough to send me the actual headline here. That is the newspaper. Kennedy shot dead. Lyndon Johnson is sworn in. That's what people had to deal with right after the assassination. LBJ taking over. And in those days, the only thing that LBJ was really known for was flipping out. He was known as kind of the Texas sidekick, the loudmouth Senate Majority Leader. And it's quite... What's that?
A brute.
A brute, yes, exactly. And he had these outbursts in public. A lot of these, it's very interesting that they look them over. But I found 4 where he flipped out in public and Kennedy sort of brought him back down to earth. And it's quite interesting because he was volatile, and there's some very odd things in relation to LBJ right off the bat that I want to suggest. One is that when he first got in as VP, and of course he blackmailed himself onto the ticket, and for electoral purposes, it may have actually helped Kennedy, oddly enough, but not ultimately. But it's very interesting because he's very over the top fascinated with this idea of getting Sarah Hughes, his Texas friend, who's a local judge there, as a federal judge. And he bothers Kennedy day and night to get this to happen. And I've always wondered, why Sarah Hughes in all this? There's a lot of weird things about Sarah Hughes, but one of the most significant things is that when the getaway of Air Force One takes place right after the assassination, they quote unquote swear in LBJ. It's not even on a Bible. And the judge that they call and they get in to do it is Sarah Hughes, the same judge that he's bugging and pestering. There's all these notes in the early 2 to 3 weeks of Kennedy just getting in, saying Lyndon really is, his top priority is getting this woman as a federal judge, which does happen through JFK. But then she's the one swearing him in this false ceremony. There is no way to swear in a president with a federal judge on Air Force One heading out of Texas going to Washington, D.C. That was done literally for the cameras. It had no binding effect of anything. But it is very interesting in my mind that they selected her to do it, and she's the same one that LBJ was so insane about getting. So we're going to do a little bit of a rewind through LBJ's life here. LBJ, at the very end of his life, is suffering psychological breakdown. And one of the biggest demons that's dogging him is, a number of lawyers have come forward saying there was a lot available to the psychiatrist who could keep LBJ quiet about his role in the assassination. The ghost of that, along with the debacle of Vietnam and the unraveling of his own presidency, after basically stealing the presidency from President Kennedy, really unraveled him as a person. And he had a number of psychiatrists at the end, and I'm sure that the psychological records would show just what a messed up individual he was. So this is what happens when you take on the deep state's mantle. It kind of sucks out all of your will to live. And in LBJ's case, it unraveled him, and his demons kind of caught up with him there. And then he dies at 64 years of age at his ranch, only a few years after leaving the presidency. In a way, you wonder, if you look at it, it's actually less than 10 years from when he steals the presidency. So when you think of it that way, was it really worth it?
Right. He bought himself 8 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Seeing Site says he even got hippie hair.
Yeah. What's weird is they say that he was actually smoking pot, and that was a recommendation from the psychologist, is the long hair smoking pot, hanging out at his Texas ranch, which had some very interesting underground caverns loaded with some very interesting material that I bet you didn't know was there either. Hello, gold, as the strange theme in the background of this episode. This is your life, LBJ. Here he is getting sworn in as a congressman in the 1930s. And guess who he's getting sworn in with there? That is FDR. And he's trying to cultivate himself into the good graces of FDR. And FDR's comments about him is like, he's a very interesting guy. He certainly knows all of the different habits of the other congressmen, what they like to drink, who they like to visit. He realizes that the guy is already up to all kinds of intelligence tricks. And this is what will give him so much in common with J. Edgar Hoover, when he gets into that very, very tight relationship with Hoover that he doesn't seem to have with anyone else. But Hoover is really into this man's man, as it were. With Hoover's help, LBJ blackmails his way onto the ticket. And I'm going to put this, a lot of people have suggested the different ways that he got onto the Kennedy ticket. But in fact, he was Kennedy's opponent in the 1960 primary for the Democratic nomination. And what happened was he hired a team to break into Kennedy's doctor's office to see if he could get some materials saying, that, he had some kind of a sex disease, or because of Addison's disease, he wouldn't live long. They were just looking for anything that they could. This is the kind of dirty player that he was. And it's interesting because that material came out in his battle in the 1964 election with Barry Goldwater. It didn't happen during the election. But Evelyn Lincoln gives a very interesting story about how Lyndon landed on the ticket in the first place, which I found interesting. They weren't going to select Lyndon. And then the word came through. They got a letter, and they were in these hotel rooms sending messages back and forth. And they looked at it. And she said that Bobby and Jack just stared off into space for about 2 hours and were completely flabbergasted. So what was going on in the background is that Hoover had given LBJ enough to blackmail his way onto the ticket. And they had a number of, they had a lot of resistance and a lot of reasons not to put him on the ticket. But Bobby was adamant beyond Jack, saying, don't let him on the ticket under any circumstances. But as it turns out, he got himself the nod. And a lot of people wondered, aren't you giving up so much power as Senate Majority Leader with all the deals that you're making and everything else? Because a VP is a real nothing position. And I have to say that in the case of LBJ, it really would have been under ordinary circumstances. But he was talking to an aide who recalled later, he said, Kennedy's not going to live through this term. I'm going to be the president. And the aide assumed that, he had access to some secret health thing about Kennedy. He wasn't thinking, he's going to have him assassinated. in the first year, what LBJ tried to do was boss his way in and ask for all these extra things that a VP didn't have. And he wanted all these really kind of way outside the park powers that normal VPs didn't have. And he was sort of trying to shove into the presidency a lot of these different directives. So the first year is contentious between the two of them before LBJ realizes, oh, I'm not going to get what I want from these people. And Kennedy, what he does is he's the first one who sets up the VP to like go worldwide to have all these funeral stops. And so he sends off LBJ to a number of different places and exotic places to represent the U.S., but he gets him out of his hair, which is a good idea. And in the background, Bobby Kennedy is watching, and he's seeing all these criminal things in the background with LBJ, which is what he was concerned about in the beginning. And this becomes a major factor in the middle of all this. At a certain point, Kennedy asks LBJ, basically, give me the background on anything that you think you might be vulnerable on. And LBJ is basically like, if anybody said anything bad about me, especially if it was Bobby, it's all BS and everything's okay. And, no, I don't have anything in my background. There's not going to be any problem. Now, in the meantime, Bobby's getting all kinds of intel about what LBJ has been up to. And it has to do with a couple of major figures who are now getting into trouble. And one of them is Bobby Baker, who's the Secretary of the Senate, who's involved in a number of bribe schemes. And those bribe schemes are all revolving around his access to LBJ as Senate Majority Leader. Now, this will eventually land Bobby Baker in prison, but the other person that he's closely attached to is our friend, Billy Sol Estes. And it's from this association with Sol Estes that this deeper history can be known. That is the major part in all this, which is when the presidential limousine makes that turn onto Elm Street in 1963, LBJ is ready not just to be thrown off the ticket, but he's ready to be thrown in prison. That's what's really at the heart of the immediacy, in that sense, of the assassination. And what they needed to do on the CIA side is have the assassination go down, but then they really needed LBJ locked in for what they wanted to do. And so this is how they were able to do it. And that prison piece is a major thing hanging out in the background that people like Robert Caro and the official biographers don't want to touch at all. They'll just say, oh, yeah, he was involved with a few shady characters, but, he was a political survivor, so he didn't have that much to do with them anyway. Hey, no, it wasn't like that at all. He had a lot to do with them, and he needed a way to extricate himself from the amount of legal trouble he was about to head into, especially with Bobby Kennedy on his tail. That's the real story of the 1963 sort of standoff between the CIA, Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson hanging out there in the middle as the person who's going to take up the reins of the presidency. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 185. It's JFK Coup, CIA Aerospace Evidence Revealed, New Evidence Revealed, which are the Billy Sol Estes tapes that were revealed on the Alex Jones Show earlier this week. Absolutely fascinating. And I think they're going to open up a larger discussion. And I'm going to show how they can be used to open up the UFO file. This is the most interesting part. Instead of having these phony, ridiculous CIA people running these congressional hearings, being like, oh, I've got 40 whistleblowers. And I've talked to some of these guys, let me tell you, what you're going to be looking at with these situations is they're going to throw everything against the wall. And I wanted to say this as an aside, with the amount of time that we spend covering the UFO file on this show. There's been a mass of UFO stories that are just hitting hard, and they're using network stuff, podcasts, traditional media, alternative media, whatever they can to get this UFO wave going. And what's happening is you're hearing all these things like, oh, whistleblower says he saw an egg-shaped craft, and News Nation has the exclusive. Mark your calendar, Greer had something where he was saying, oh, if I can get 1 billion hits on this thing, You know, if people will do that, then I'll have all these whistleblowers come forward. So there's a lot of marketing going on. There's a lot of intel going on. Welcome to 2025. But you're being really hemmed in if you're paying attention to these things, and the public is being rushed with these stories. What's going on with that? And of course, the year started off with a bang with the Tesla Cybertruck blowing up in front of Trump Tower. And that guy, in his manifesto, if in fact that was his manifesto, or if he even got blown up in that explosion, it's not very clear now, is it? Livelsberger talks about UAPs, and then in the next manifesto, he talks about UFOs. Well, I don't think any of that is by accident. I think this is what they're going for. This is the route they've decided on, which is the UFO threat. That is the aspect that they're getting behind, and that's why you're seeing the rush of all this faulty information. And they might release some things that look good here and there. So far, they haven't. But I can tell you that the people that are behind it and the CIA forces that are staging these congressional hearings, and I just got word that there's going to be a new congressional hearing at the end of February on all this nonsense from the UFO threatsters. You've got on one side Chris Mellon, the DoD billionaire we spotlighted many times in this program. Now you have Peter Thiel funding UFO researchers who are come out of the blue. We've never heard of them before. They have nothing to do with the UFO file. And they come in with all these resources and things into the independent media and hijacking themes and all the rest of it. And now you have people like Elizondo, who was the root sort of core liar for the whistleblowers on the CIA side who came out. And now he's coming out and he's mimicking. They've done a lot of market research, let's say in the last 2 years, and things that have worked with people, you know, where people kind of get more of a closer acceptance. Now they have those as his talking points, and he just sits there and kind of recites these talking points. And none of the people who interview him know enough to call him on his lies. So this is a problem, but you've got such a huge wave of it. I can tell you from all the years that I've been doing this, I have not seen, I mean, there was a huge wave in 2023 with Grush and all the rest, for sure. They were setting that up there. It didn't work out the way that they wanted it to. That was the big Mellon effort. I think now that we have Mellon and Thiel, and they think that they can now move themselves into the Trump administration, which, by the way, Mellon and Elizondo were anti-Trump right up until he won. Keep that in mind. Now they're changing their tune, and it's interesting because, and this is very discouraging, but Don Jr., who runs a podcast, keeps having Elizondo on. And, you know, in the background, you hear people saying, oh, you know, like, Lou in his brief called for a UAP czar. What brief? You know, what, Lou just happened to send something to the White House and that makes it a brief? That's just Lou writing stuff, wanting to make himself the UAP czar. But unfortunately, I think that he may be getting help from Don Jr. in that. Look, you cannot place a CIA person in as a UFO UAP czar. And that's the best way to short circuit your presidency and any kind of real sort of disclosures around the X technology. So that thing, if I can issue a kind of a public reminder to President Trump, it would be, do not have the CIA whistleblower, in quotes, counterintelligence agent who's working for a UFO threat, Lou Elizondo, anywhere near the White House on the matter. The guy is a complete disgrace, and he worked for James Clapper. What more do you need to know? So, and also reject, you know, in general, in the public, reject that whole wave that's coming into you from CIA headquarters in Langley. That's where it's coming from. So, you know, we've made that pretty plain. It's not even that it's about Elizondo. They could use anybody to do this. So that's not a personal thing. But you have to remember that these are people that are rolled out on purpose because they're good at counterintelligence. And counterintelligence means you're the best professional liars on the planet. You have to be, because you have a foreign adversary. But when you use them the way that the CIA is using them currently, what you're actually getting is the public becomes the foreign adversary. And so the CIA uses it against the public in order to achieve things like the NDAA attaching a UFO defense office. So that's where we get Arrow and all these types of things. Mm-hmm. So there's no question that the heat is on and the money train, the gravy train around the UAP thing is on. But where that process ends is in a huge, boondoggle for the defense contractors and the continuity of government people assuming higher and deeper authority in situations because through NORAD, they have the ability to call emergencies and things like that. So the UFO threat thing is actually very dangerous on a lot of levels. So you don't want CIA people anywhere near the power levers on that. Spread the word long and far on that. The Elizondo people, the Peter Thiel money people rolling into the UFO space. No. The Peter Thiel thing, too, is interesting because I'm now seeing it a lot. And he, for some reason, is fixating himself into the UFO file. So my guess, considering where he's coming from as this kind of Soros character in the background, is that the agenda is so big around dominating things on the ground from the sky and for that space economy and for that space control grid that these people have been told in the background there's a huge gold rush, attach yourself to this. So make sure, as we move in this independent space, that these things that are showing up and pretending to be grassroots that are funded by people like Thiel and Mellon don't get to first base. That's very important. Another baseball analogy there for you. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
David Termina says, seems like the release is timed to force Trump's hand to declassify the JFK files. Do you think they will try to pin the whole crime on LBJ?
You can't. They may try to, but executive action, you need such a wide apparatus in order to do the crime, cover up the crime, and then make sure the media stays in line. You can't do that with just, a VP who has a criminal background. But it is important for us to understand the criminal aspects involved with LBJ's piece around the involvement in the assassination and his role. So, there's an interesting thing where Madeline Brown, who was his mistress, came out at the end of her life because she felt that, she had his son and all these other things. And she felt really that the public needed to know about what was going on in relation to this. So at the end of her life, she came forward in 2003 and she said, it's 2002 actually. She said that when she had this meeting with LBJ after the assassination, she said everyone in Texas was saying that LBJ was behind it and it upset her. And she said, did you have something to do with this? And that he flipped out and all the rest of it. And he said, no, it wasn't me, but it was, it was the intelligence people and, some of the people that were cheerleading for it on the big oil side here. I knew them, but I wasn't involved directly in the assassination. So this is what he's telling his mistress. But it's very interesting because LBJ in 1969 will go to Walter Cronkite, and Walter Cronkite will say, oh, well, Oswald was just a lone shooter. Why don't you think the public will respect that or whatever? And LBJ is like, well, I never was particularly happy with that myself. And then Cronkite says, well, wait a minute. Does that mean you don't believe your own Warren Commission? And LBJ kicks into this whole talking point. He's like, they were the most honorable men on the planet. But then he goes, I don't think that they knew, of what was motivating Oswald or the others involved in the assassination. So he levels that out now after leaving the presidency. So Cronkite is like, I've got the hottest piece of videotape here. Wait till I run this report. And he gets a call from Johnson's office that says, don't run the last 5 minutes of that interview. It's a national security issue. Just don't talk about it. But we have, of course, the film now. It's come out. So these are the moves that LBJ, they're kind of his own insurance policies over time. And what's interesting is there are tapes now that have come out that were part of the tapes that Nixon and his family were trying to hold back. And there's still a battle over those tapes, by the way, even though we have, about 28% of them. And so he calls in Richard Helms, the CIA director, and presumably part of the reason he called him in was he was hearing things in the background that in his shattered state, LBJ may say something, because he had already said to another CBS reporter, we were running a Murder Incorporated in Central America, and it may have kicked back and killed Kennedy, you know. And so he was starting to kind of unravel, and they knew that. And so Nixon calls in the CIA director, and he says, I need all the information about what you were up to, the CIA, in relation to the Kennedy assassination. Don't worry. I've let you guys do a lot of, you know, dirty tricks. You guys have done that, and I've been right there for you. But, you know, in the who shot Kennedy angle, I need you to give me the intel. And Helms is sitting there completely quiet. He doesn't say anything. He realizes, of course, he's being taped. And, but it shows you with Nixon calling him in, and actually this tape is now only available to us in the past year or two. So now we have Nixon coming in, trying to play cleanup around what the CIA did in the CIA assassination of Kennedy. So that is starting to give us tips and gives us ideas about what's happening. And when we look at that and we think about in the same year, we've got LBJ unraveling and saying all these things, start to put two and two together and say, Nixon's thinking, you know, there's these pressures to reinvestigate the Kennedy thing. I need, you know, he's trying to get the intel directly from Helms. Later, he will send, during Watergate, he will send aides over to Helms, and he'll say, look, tell him not to look any further into this Watergate stuff because it will open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And Haldeman, who's taking the message, says, oh, wait a minute. He only mentions the Bay of Pigs thing in relation to the JFK assassination. That's kind of the code word. So he goes very calmly over to Richard Helms' office, and he says, you know, the president really thinks you should just not look any further into Watergate. And he has a message for you, which is it's going to open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing. So you really don't want to do that. And that he said that Helms flipped out, jumped up on his desk and yelled at him. And he said, red-faced, we had nothing to do with that. That kind of reaction from the cold as ice Helms, I think, lets you know everything you need to know about what's at stake in those types of communications. So when we get this glimpse of this recording that has come out, it gives us some insight about the deep state battle that was taking place in the background there. And one of the key figures involved was the person who assumed the presidency. That's important. The coup organized by the CIA, but they needed their front man, because if the front man wasn't on board, you'd have all kinds of problems. They needed to know they weren't going to be investigated, for example, which is exactly why LBJ puts Dulles in charge of the investigation. That's the ultimate, you know, middle finger to the Kennedy legacy there, because Kennedy had fired Dulles, in fact. Now I'm going to read the transcript of the tape here. And do you have anything else?
Nevin Moore wanted you to reiterate. Did DJ say Trump will release the JFK files on 121?
No, he's going to release the drone report about what the drones are. And I thought it was pretty straight up of him to do that. He knows, he's been getting these intelligence briefings. He knows what's going on. And his decision is totally different from what the Biden people are doing. He wants it out there. So, and he's right, because you can't have these things. You cannot, there is no situation in American history where you've had drones flying over cities that nobody knows who is responsible for them. This is, let me tell you, the drone thing is a crisis. I've tried to put this across in the reports, and it's very important because, you know, you want to do it without being an alarmist. And yet I can tell you from the explanations that they've given on the things that they're holding back so much that it gives me like tremendous pause what they're doing, the way they're handling this. And the fact that actually the drone incursions haven't stopped. It's just the reporting went off a cliff with it. And the independent media was too stupid, I'm sorry, but they were too stupid to see what was going on. Now they've all been proven idiots because the White House itself, you know, Congress people are introducing resolutions about drones over the White House. And what recently happened in the last week, all the Chinese drone makers have said we're taking the gates off on the software of the drones that we have so that now they can surveil anything in every space that they are. Well, they didn't before. And so by pulling that gate off of their software surveillance equipment, any drone anywhere could be picking up information and sending it back to the Chinese government. Now, I don't think that the Chinese government is solely responsible for all the drones, nor is it Iranian or anything like that. There's something much deeper going on involving Northcom. And so the first thing on the independent side that they need to get over is the misidentification thing. No, they were proven wrong. There are thousands of drones that are unidentified in the sky, and they are a problem. That's the first thing. You know, what do they call those different things? First, you have to admit the problem, and then from there you can solve it. So first, you have to get rid of denial. No, the drones are there. It's not misidentification. Hello, UFO and independent media that dropped the ball. Then where do you go from there? The next thing is, what are they? What is the government telling us about it? Why would the government not tell us about it? So there's something much deeper going on there, which is why Trump saying on January 21st, I'm putting out the report. That's his first real day in office. So he knows how important it is. It may in fact be the reason why they moved the inauguration indoors. And it's quite fascinating because I'm thinking about the inauguration of President Kennedy in 1961 and how it was very, very cold, bitter cold, much colder than what they supposedly have the reason that they moved it indoors this time because of the bitter cold. It was really, it's always cold during the inauguration. But that 61 inauguration and then 2025, we're going across 64 years here. And there are echoes in that 61 inauguration that reach us. In fact, all the attacks on Kennedy and trying to not get him sworn in as HHS secretary, the battle between the deep state and the Kennedy faction strangely continues. And Trump is a focal point in a lot of this. One, because he knows about the UFO file through his uncle, and two, because he knows about the deep state bodies and where they're buried through Roy Cohn. So this is the battle. This is the heart of the battle, the overt government versus the covert government, and using that in the correct way. So we really understand that. We have a public policy arm. We have a constitutional law. We have an entire system of representation and all the rest of it. The deep state doesn't operate with any of those things. So we have to understand the difference. And that system crashing into this system, causing a policy change and then withdrawing, the only thing that the public system is left is to craft through the ruins to see what happened. That's part of what we're doing here tonight with the JFK assassination, even though we know it's 61 years ago. The Kennedy assassination and the removal of the president not only represented a complete affront to, our entire constitutional republic, but it also represents an ongoing pattern. So the pattern is evident in 9/11. The pattern is evident in all these deep events, including the financial coup and COVID and all the rest of it. And until you get into the faction that is committing those deep events and how they're influencing history, you're not going to have a full picture of what's happening. So, in fact, if you get the real picture around the Kennedy assassination, it changes the culture completely. And that could be maybe the kind of crucial deciding factor in relation to Trump and his transparency piece, which is where do you go with the Kennedy information, which I'm sure he has already seen. All right. Our friend Shane Stevens now, who is the grandson of Billy Sol Estes, let out this tape, and the tape is very compelling. And a couple of the key moments I've excerpted here, and it's Clifford Carter, who was the top aide to LBJ, but he was also became the DNC executive director. And in 1966, he had to resign because of bribery issues again, but he reemerges in some unusual roles later. But anyway, here's a conversation right after Billy Sol Estes got out of prison the first time, because he's in and out of prison a couple of times. And he goes to prison for all these crimes around these cotton allotments, government shenanigans that result in a murder of an agricultural official named Henry Marshall. So what happens is he has this meeting and he records it, and the person he's talking to, Clifford Carter, is letting it rip about what's going on. And so Billy Sol Estes says, how are you, Cliff? It's been a minute. By the way, Carter dies 9 days after this tape. And this is what he has to say.
How does he die?
Oh, he's just found dead in his hotel.
Okay.
And by the way, he was only 52 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And when they asked, they asked the family, well, what was the cause of death, And they were like, well, he worked himself to death for LBJ. Okay, that's 1971. It's the same year that Billy Sol Estes gets out of prison. And it's also the same year that Mac Wallace dies in a car crash, a one-person car crash. Okay. So Billy Sol comes in and he says, how are you, Cliff? And Cliff says, and this is on tape now, direct transcript, quote, well, Sol, it's been a pretty touch-and-go situation lately. Lyndon and I have had quite a few unpleasant words here lately over the deal that he hired Mac Wallace to assassinate the president. It's been hectic in every way, but we've lived through it this far, I guess. We'll continue to do so. Lyndon should have never issued that order to Mac. But we've had our difficulties, and I'm true blue to Lyndon, as you know I've always been. Tried to carry out every order that he's given me. But this one I'll probably never be able to forget. With the times that we've had in Texas, and especially the embarrassment that Lyndon had gotten and had put up with from Kennedy, I guess there wasn't anything else that he could do. And he goes on to lament the fact that Lyndon was involved in the assassination and that Mac Wallace, his hitman, took part in it. And they go back and forth about, was there any other way that Lyndon could have handled this, but it's interesting, over and over again, you'll hear this thing about Lyndon and being embarrassed. I find this is a very interesting piece because the mistress also says, that LBJ the day before of the assassination says, those Kennedys, those damn Kennedys, this will be the last time they embarrass me ever again. And it's not a threat, it's a promise. And he goes into this whole thing. But then you hear this other thing about embarrassment. I started to wonder about that a little bit. And it could be that the embarrassment was that they were going to let him go to prison because before the McClellan Committee going on in the Senate, they were investigating all of the death of Henry Marshall and these other things. And there was all this talk, and Richard Nixon actually went on the record that day of the assassination while he was in Dallas talking to a reporter, and he said, everyone knows that LBJ is off the ticket. And Kennedy had told his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, we're not going to have LBJ on the ticket next time. It's going to be Governor Terry Sanford. But without the power of the vice presidency and no longer Senate Majority Leader, and with Bobby Kennedy opening the floodgates on the crimes, and letting the FBI really in on this. I'm going to show you how Kennedy was aware of the crimes of LBJ in that period, especially in relation to Sol Estes and Marshall, and how President Kennedy himself not only took questions about the Billy Sol Estes matter, but in private was very interested in the Henry Marshall killing and went to the Justice Department through his brother and the FBI and got 75 agents of the FBI to look into the Henry Marshall killing. That is a lot of attention. It is a lot of attention. I was shocked by the number. Yeah. So this I find very interesting, and I'll have to tell you that when we're looking at the tapestry of history, the term embarrassment showing up in these people who, after all, were kind of co-conspirators in their own sense in the context of the call. Certainly Cliff Carter is the one acting out the orders of LBJ and going to Mac Wallace, who's ping-ponging back and forth between California and Texas, which is also interesting. But he's working there at LTV, Ling Temco Vout. He is the one who gets to decide what they purchase. He's in a tremendous position as a defense contractor, and he has been for the past decade, even though he should be nowhere near a defense contractor that works with the United States of America, because his security clearance, after he was found guilty of murdering a Gulf pro in 1951, should have been revoked a long time ago. So there's so many mysteries there, but I think we can get to the heart of it. But think about this embarrassing thing for a moment. And really, if you sift through it, the Kennedys will not embarrass me again. So the embarrassing thing really wouldn't be to drop him from the ticket, in my opinion. That can always be, there are always splits that take place in politics. But going to prison for LBJ would have been very embarrassing. And if he knew that the Kennedys were on board with that, this could be what the nature, the theme of what's going on there in that conversation. Now, why would they get to a point where Mac Wallace would come up in relation to this? Let's backtrack a little bit to a very strange grand jury situation taking place in 1984 after our friend Billy Sol Estes gets out of prison the second time. Remember, he went in originally from 1964 to 1971. He gets out on parole, and then by 1979, he's back in, baby. He either gets busy living or gets busy dying. So maybe he's more comfortable on the inside at that point. But it's very interesting because our friend Billy Sol in 1979 goes back into prison. Then he comes out, and there it's for hiding tax assets and all of these different deals that he's doing. It's a totally different set of crimes that they put him in for. 1983, they were like, we've had enough of you. You're out. Even though his term was to go to 1989, they let him out early. And he starts to look at the whole situation. It's now 10 years since LBJ has died. And he's looking at that whole situation and say, I basically was the one who went to prison for all of that stuff. And I think he's just had enough of holding back the story of LBJ's involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy. And so this is very interesting because Douglas Caddy, who, as the Watergate lawyer, has been on this program many times and gave us the key revelation from E. Howard Hunt that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file, and that conversation, they were best friends, Hunt and Caddy. That conversation took place in private as they were discussing like family arrangements for when Hunt was going to prison. So this wasn't, some headline grabbing thing. He told him Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to give our most vital secret to the Russians. And Caddy said, what was the secret? And Hunt said, the UFO file. So this is where it gets interesting because Caddy reappears. Caddy does show up as this very interesting character in history. He's right in the heart of all these different things. And I've had a good laugh with him about that at times. And of course, he was deep in Watergate. But here in this situation, he's representing Billy Sol, and he says to the U.S. Attorney, Stephen Trott, look, you've reopened this Henry Marshall case because enough evidence has come forward after 20 years. And Billy Sol Estes will give you not only the information about the Marshall murder, but guess what? He has 17 other murders that LBJ was involved in. Now, when we look at the list that they submitted to that U.S. attorney, let's just look at some of the key ones that they list. The top one is the killing of Henry Marshall, the killing of George Kratilik, the killing of Ike Rogers and his secretary. These were all people that were around the crime who were getting bumped off back in 1962 before Billy Sol went to prison over this scheme that he had going on with Bobby Baker and LBJ. The killing of Josepha Johnson, that is Lyndon Johnson's sister. And here he is saying that LBJ ordered the killing of his own sister. The killing of John Kinzer, that is a golf pro who was this kind of fabulous guy who was into acting and everything. And this guy, the ladies just loved John Kinzer. But Mac Wallace shoots John Kinzer at the pitch and putt. And it's a very strange thing there. But before we get to that, the killing of John Kinzer and the bottom there, the killing of JF Kennedy. That is what the grand jury got as an offer from Billy Sol Estes to testify. And he gives them the testimony about how Mac Wallace was ordered by LBJ to commit these crimes. And at the very bottom there, number 8, the killing of John F. Kennedy. So he lists these 8 murders, and then he says there's more, there's 9 others. So 17 altogether. Now, it's very interesting because they decide, well, we can't tackle the Kennedy thing with this, but we do take your testimony in relation to Henry Marshall. And guess what? We're going to change the verdict on this. It was not a suicide, it was a murder. So they agree that, in fact, this was not a suicide. Now, I want to go back in time to the case because Henry Marshall, you may or may not have heard of him, but he's a pivotal figure in all this because he stood up to this Goliath machine of LBJ and Big Oil and all these other forces that were trying to work this agricultural scene across America and in Texas and use the government to enrich themselves with all these cotton allotments and different things that didn't exist. And it's very much like the HUD fraud that would hit very hard later because one of the things that they charge Sol Estes with is having only 5,000 of these grain silos, but 33,000 mortgages for them. And there's just so many things in the case against Sol Estes and what they go with. But the idea is, in general, it's exploiting the government money coming in. He's getting money on both sides for things that don't actually exist. And there's a number of different crimes there. But the key aspect and the key point that he's bringing forward, and that obviously he felt, I'll go back and I'll tell them about the LBJ side. He feels, and he says in his book, that Lyndon Johnson had assured him he wasn't going to go to prison. But he ends up doing lots of prison time. And so somewhere in the back of his mind, he's thinking, I'm going to let this out. Just as an aside, Bobby Baker, at the same time, who's the Secretary of the Senate, he's in a bribery scandal. And eventually, in 1965, he will go to prison. So Billy Sol Estes, close business partner with LBJ, prison. Bobby Baker, close liaison, feeding bribes for access to LBJ, prison. LBJ, no prison. And, he's basically using these people as subdividers. The people around Sol Estes getting bumped off. The guy was working with the grain silos and managing that for him. They find him dead. He's a key witness in the whole thing. The bookkeeper, they find him dead, and all of these cases of people, they're always killed by carbon monoxide, which is how Mac Wallace bites it in the end. So there's a pattern here of this particular strain of deep state activity around Lyndon Johnson, which is very much like that witness assassination list that goes heavy in the Kennedy assassination. So by the time we get to Lyndon himself getting sworn in, this fake swearing in with the Sarah Hughes judge that he wanted there and dragging the Jackie, the widow of President Kennedy, out to do this with him. This is a very important shot for a lot of reasons because it represents a triumph for these dark forces on the LBJ side because he's been able to avoid prison, 1. He's been able to assume the presidency, which he felt he was denied, 2. And now he's able to give the military industrial complex and their manufacturers everything that they want in relation to Vietnam. These things will all bring him low in the grand scheme of things. But, he will bring forward, there's no question, a number of changes through the Great Society program. And, a lot of those kind of excesses, kind of FDR on steroids kind of thing, some of those programs were good programs. There's no question about it. But also some of them could be exploited, like HUD, which they invented here, so that it could be used as a slush fund for other things. So I wonder if part of the Great Society activity that LBJ is setting up there is going for, black budget extravaganza, which is why he gets such a green light to get these things happening while he's in the middle of a war, which seems highly unusual. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep here in LBJ, Mac Wallace, and our friend Billy Sol Estes. We're going to be taking your questions now in the second part of the program, which is coming up in about 15 minutes here. I should be able to finish everything up between now and then. And I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That is a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch. And you really need that at this point with all the censorship around the work that I do. And you're going to find that in Google and YouTube and everywhere else. The best way to stay abreast of things that are going on is to sign up for that newsletter. It's free. It comes to you once a week on Friday. It will let you know about the amazing X-Series episodes, mind-blowing episodes we have coming up for you, the incredible interviews as well, great guests that will blow your mind in the first half of 2025, documentaries. We have the JFK final speech, Antarctica UFO file. That whole documentary, an hour and a half, that's the latest one, absolutely incredible, ties directly in to what we're talking about tonight. And finally, live events and everything else associated with it. We have some great collaborations coming up as well. So it's all there in the newsletter. Stand up and be counted. Make sure you're on that Dark Journalist newsletter list and spread the word of what we're doing here. Get behind the program, become a subscriber, and let everyone know about what potent independent media can be all about in 2025. Okay, so we'll take your questions there in 15 minutes. Before I jump off into Mac Wallace, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Roger Z says, after LBJ was sworn in on the plane returning JFK's body back to D.C., he went over to a table and signed an order for 200,000 active combat troops to go to Vietnam.
Oh, yeah.
Golden Warrior says, Vietnam was the Golden Triangle. The heroin was being made in Laos and in a Pepsi plant, and the war was a cover for drug trafficking.
Well, what about the scandal that they had when they were using the bodies that were coming back and they were stuffing the hollowed out bodies with packs of heroin? I mean, they had so many things along this line. And some of it did actually come to light, just like certain things come to light around the Kennedy assassination. But the crux, the main piece of the why and the who is behind it, these are the things that stay aloof. And you might say, even in this Trump renaissance that we're going to get with this new administration, it's Trump times 2, right? And he's got some great people like Kash Patel, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard. These are phenomenal players. This is a great team. But I will say this, that, they know, remember the theme at 2023 Bilderberg was regain trust. They knew the amount of trust that they had lost by this big overarching push for the kind of COVID world domination thing. And either the technology, they had overestimated, the world wasn't ready for that type of complete takeover, whatever it happened to be, we didn't get it exactly, but they're only retooling the program, and this is the part of the problem, which is their consolidation plan never ends. Their centralization plan never ends. So, I think it is important if we can get to the root of why these things happened and who was behind it. And when I go and we investigate Ling Temco Vout in relation to Mac Wallace and how this story comes out to us through Sol Estes, who was an LBJ insider, I mean, can't be denied, So you could ask yourself, if this wasn't true, if Mac Wallace wasn't involved, why would Sol Estes be saying all this stuff? Why would Madeline Brown, his mistress, have come out and said it? And, it's not like there was even that big a push around the books that he put out or things of that nature. So for me, it is, it's payback time. And that's the way that I view what took place there. And I will say this about the tapes that came out. The Shane Stevens, who was the grandson of Billy Sol Estes, putting out the tapes and releasing them on Alex Jones, he had earlier gone to President Trump. He said he had arranged a meeting, through donation or whatever it happened to be. And he got Trump and he got to tell him, and he said, I have these tapes and you can have access to them. And I think that Trump got the tapes. So, this is more information on the Trump side as well. I'm sure he's very aware, but the fact that he went through this route and then ended up on Alex, for me, I definitely, I don't think that there's a manipulated timing involved with the release. I just think that it's been there, because remember in 2003, Nigel Turner, through the Men Who Killed Kennedy documentary series, he released all of that information about Sol Estes and Mac Wallace. He just didn't have the tapes. Now, if you go further back, Joaquin Yostin has an incredible book about the dark side of Lyndon Johnson. That's 1968. You go a little further back from that, 1964, there's a major book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon. And what is that guy obsessed with in the case? He's obsessed with LBJ's relationship with convicted murderer Mac Wallace. So, you can see, if you look, there have been investigators who have touched on it. Penn Jones touched on it. But the stuff was so held back, and the independent, look at this was so held back under the mainstream media gridlock on all of this, that when the tape rolls out here in 2025, this is information that has been building up very legitimately in the background. So the idea that this was just some distraction psyop or something doesn't hold, because the Mac Wallace LBJ story's been rolling since 1964, baby. Okay, so let's get into Mac Wallace. And this part, Henry Marshall is the way in, who was the noble official that wouldn't take the bribes. This was the problem. And that's ultimately how our friend Billy Sol ends up in prison.
Isn't it interesting that there's often a secondary murder or secondary crime that is more revealing about the more important one?
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's no question about it. And Marshall is an incredible example of this, because, in fact, it is that clash, a kind of good and evil clash, and then the disposing of Marshall, which turns out to be the thing that puts the greatest amount of pressure on the whole situation, and the corruption and the criminality, which had been building up since LBJ got into Congress. And of course, his attempts to get into the Senate failed on a couple of different occasions. Finally, in 1948, he manages, through 200 votes that showed up out of nowhere, which were apparently all dead people, the whole Box 13 scandal that gets him in, that follows him the rest of his life, because, basically the other person had won. The other thing that follows him around in the background is the mistress, Madeline Brown. This is her with his LBJ's son, illegitimate son, Stephen. It's one of the rare pictures of Stephen ever seen. And Stephen will die before he's 40. And there's a lot of strange things involved around his death, or he also got a terminal illness very quickly as soon as he sued the Johnson estate. Very, very strange. And it's part of the reason why Madeline Brown, let LBJ have it at the very end. And there's a quick thing there. A man who claimed to be LBJ's illegitimate son dies of cancer. A man who claimed in a 1987 lawsuit that he was the illegitimate son of Lyndon Baines Johnson has died of lymphatic cancer. Stephen Mark Brown, 39, died Friday at Methodist Medical Center. His $10.5 million lawsuit against Johnson's widow, Lady Bird, alleging she conspired to deny him a part of the Johnson inheritance, was dismissed 2 years later when Brown, a naval operations specialist, failed to appear in court. And what's interesting is, according to Madeline Brown, he's basically kidnapped by the military at that point and not allowed to appear when he was supposed to go to court, so he would default in the middle of all this. And his mother, Madeline Brown, said she had an affair with LBJ from 48 to 69. So there's no question, and there's a number of people who corroborate that relationship. But I think the key thing is that there were things in the background forcing this story out. And the lawsuit was part of it, I think, which is once they didn't want Stephen in any capacity, they just kind of dust him. The mother figures, oh, yeah, well, I'm not going to let that go without a fight. I am going to tell the whole story and all the secrets that I've been holding on to. And I think what happens there is the LBJ story starts to unravel. And because the media's kept a tight lid on it, oh, he's the Great Society guy. Oh, he was brought down by, you know, the terrible Vietnam thing. But he rose to the occasion when Kennedy was taken from us, you know, by Lee Harvey Oswald, the crazed communist. None of that stuff holds up at all. But that was what they were feeding everyone. And the official biographies, or, you know, the encyclopedia and the Wikipedia on LBJ, they're ridiculous. They don't mention any of his scandals. Once in a while, they'll say, often brutal in his Senate negotiation. Yeah. You might want to dig a little bit deeper, shall we say. Okay. So Billy Sol, the wheeler dealer, one of the things that he put on the record was that there were, you know, two people who were really trying to get in LBJ's good graces, and he was one of them. And the other one is D.H. Byrd. And D.H. Byrd, with LTV, the experimental aerospace company, he's somebody with a great deal of access to the assassination scene because he owns the Texas School Book Depository. One of the things that's interesting to me about what Billy Sol has to say in relation to Mac Wallace is that it is LBJ who gives the order to kill Henry Marshall, the agricultural official who is exposing Billy Sol. And he's unraveling the scheme. But in that scheme are a number of LBJ crimes. So LBJ figures, okay, it's worth it. I'm going to get Billy Sol out of this mess by having Henry Marshall assassinated. Now, what's interesting is Billy Sol says that his solution was, you know, give him the position of Secretary of Agriculture. And if he doesn't take that, you know, give him a couple $1 million and give him his own ranch in Brazil. These were his ideas. But Henry Marshall didn't want to take the bribes. And he had done a lot of investigating, and he realized just how deep the corruption went. Now, let's play back and forth with this and remember that President Kennedy himself was looking into the entire situation and had called all these agents in to study the death of Henry Marshall as soon as it happened. Keep that in the back of your mind. Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? Okay. In 1961, Mac Wallace left Texas to go to Anaheim, California to work for Ling Electronics. The change of jobs is what prompted the 1961 background check by the Office of Naval Intelligence, because they can't believe this guy has access to anything with his murder record. The officer who conducted the background check said there was an investigation that I can verify. He asked that his name not be used. The second Navy intelligence officer who supervised the Texas end of the background check and now works in Dallas confirmed that the report was compiled and forwarded to Washington. Wallace had been active in politics while at the University of Texas, and authorities who investigated the Kinzer murder said they found information linking Wallace to Communist Party activity in the United States. I found that very interesting. And of course, most of this information comes from Barr McClellan, who was part of the attorney set up for LBJ in the 1960s. He was one of the junior attorneys. And he put out a book called Blood, Money, and Power in, again, that window, 2003. He was part of that revelations that, Clinton and Gerald Ford and this whole kind of range of political figures went to court and tried to block the documentary from coming out. Former Texas Ranger Clint Peoples, who investigated the Kinzer murder, said the Navy intelligence officer who compiled the background report indicated to him in 1961 that Johnson may have been a factor behind Wallace's employment with the defense contractors. Quote, I was furious that they would even consider a security clearance for Wallace with the background that he had, said Peoples, who was a U.S. Marshal in Dallas. By the way, his investigating of this whole subject became so good that by 1993, he was going to release the next level. He'd been releasing all kinds of information about LBJ. And he was filming a documentary with, a major company around LBJ's corruption with Madeline Brown and all these other people. He dies in a single car accident in Texas. That just seems to be the way that they like it. So Peoples is really on the case. And he says, I asked who could be so strong and powerful in politics that he could get a clearance for a man like this. The intelligence officer said, the vice president. So we get a lot of interesting things there in terms of the influence of LBJ, including the fact that Henry Marshall, when he is bumped off ultimately by Mac Wallace, he is presumed to have committed suicide. The only problem is he has a bolt-action rifle and 5 shots in his chest. That gets to be a real problem. So suicide in quotes there in the murder case. I'm just going to read a little bit of these news reports from that period. Then we'll go to the quote, and then we're off to your questions.
Okay.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 185. This is the JFK coup, CIA, Aerospace. Yes, Ling Tenko Vout. Not only that, but remember LBJ, when he's in the Senate, is Senator NASA. And when he's VP, he's the head of the Space Council. This guy is deep, deep in the aerospace world. And Werner von Braun and LBJ, from the time they bring over von Braun, are close, have regular contacts, spend all this time with each other. He's close to von Braun, he's close to Hoover, and ultimately he finds a sparring partner in Nixon as they both try to blackmail each other with what they know about the Kennedy assassination. Okay, a pathologist said Tuesday that an autopsy upon the exhumed body of Henry Marshall, this is what happened, which is once the questions got raised, they were like, oh, wait a minute, suicide? I don't think so. Let's exhume the body and see what we have here. The first federal official to investigate financier Billy Sol Estes indicates Marshall was murdered. Dr. Joseph Zemzik said that there were 9 to 10 bullet wounds in the body of Marshall. He said that 5 shots were fired and 1 wound appeared to be in the back. The body was discovered on his ranch June 3rd, and the death was officially marked off as suicide. The autopsy was held to obtain evidence for a grand jury investigator in Marshall's death. Now, here's the scenario, just to lay it out again in bullet points now. Marshall has detected all the unusual activity and the shenanigans of the Sol Estes Johnson stuff, bilking the government for millions, around cotton allotments, and dominating this whole agriculture scene. So they try to buy him off. They try to do all these things. And they have a meeting where Cliff Carter, the top aide to LBJ, Billy Sol Estes, and LBJ all sit around and talk about what are we going to do. And Mac Wallace is there. Now, according to Sol Estes, what they do is they say he won't be bought off. We can't give him this top agriculture job. How should we handle him? Should we discredit him? And LBJ says, no, get rid of him, assassinate him. So then Billy Sol finds out that this is what's taken place. Before I read any more on that, I'm going to go directly to Billy Sol's autobiography, which he wrote at the end of his life, and what he has to say about the murder of Henry Marshall. Cliff here is Clint Carter, the same man on the tape who is bemoaning in 1971 to Billy Sol Estes that LBJ had instructed Mac Wallace to be involved in the assassination plot against President Kennedy. Okay, this is Billy Sol now. Cliff was under instruction from Lyndon to make sure Henry Marshall would never disclose his full knowledge. Cliff called Malcolm Wallace in California and told him to come to Texas. The job was to be done this weekend. Now, Mac Wallace, very strange ping-ponging, by the way. Texas, Dallas, Texas, New York City. By the way, when he's in New York City, what do you think he's doing? He's teaching philosophy at Columbia.
Wow.
Mac Wallace, the hitman. Philosophy. Then he's University of North Carolina. He's moving through all these university tracks. And it's very interesting when you get into Mac Wallace. You see a lot of this.
You know, that's interesting. So many deep staters, when they retire from government,
Yeah.
go into academia.
True.
Right? They become presidents of colleges and whatnot.
Yeah, he's like an early indication of what's going on there. That track of New York, North Carolina, Texas, California, I think is interesting for him. And he also shows up in White Sands, which is a major UFO base, as we know. And because he's working for Ling Temco Vout, that didn't surprise me. All right. But let's go back to the hitman piece that we're being given here by Sol Estes. So he says, Mac shot Marshall 5 times with a rifle. He assumed Marshall was dead, and so he placed the glasses, wallet, and pencils on the seat of the pickup. After checking the area, he walked back to his station wagon and left. In retrospect, Mac was lucky that he was not caught. A good sheriff would have found the footprints, would have checked for fingerprints, and would have noticed there were no shells around the body. But a good sheriff was hard to buy. Clint Peoples testified that he had first met Mac Wallace in 1951. Wallace had shot Douglas Kinzer at a small golf course in Austin. Peoples had examined the evidence in that case and taken the interest in Mac. Peoples also was surprised Malcolm Wallace was sentenced to a 5-year suspended sentence after being convicted of murder. It was at that time he began to suspect there were political reasons for the sentence. Later on, he was requested to supply information to ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, after Wallace filed for a secret clearance to work for Temco Aircraft in Dallas. He reviewed the records available to him from department files and noticed the arrests for driving while intoxicated, the complaints filled by his wife for assault, and the records showed sexual deviant behavior. It's interesting. He almost has a Jeffrey Epstein background because, of course, Epstein has all those. Clint had the ONI recommendations that the secret clearance be removed. He'd given the ONI the recommendation. He also noted that Mac continued to work in a supervisory job with employees working on secret projects in aerospace for the government. Someone in Washington had overridden the secret clearance removal. I knew that Cliff had arranged for Mac to continue working in that job. The most important thing was the Federal Bureau of Investigation files on Mac stopped in 1951. When Clint pulled the files in 1984, someone had purged the files. Clint still had access to Ranger files, and they were still complete because Clint Peoples was a Texas Ranger. He had all the files that had been expunged on the government side, and that's why Mac Wallace had been allowed to do all these different things. So you can see the kind of chicanery, and this is from the horse's mouth here with Sol Estes, around Wallace shows just what a deep player he was in the middle of all this. Now, let's round out the Marshall murder. The gas station attendant, half hour before the murder takes place, sees this man loading up his car with gasoline. And he notices the guy looking around and acting strange. So later it's put together that, the same person here who's killed Henry Marshall looks exactly like Mac Wallace, and Mac Wallace already has killed Douglas Kinzer previously, and he is, after all, LBJ's hitman. Now, let's go back to the Texas School Book Depository and the fingerprint thing that was going on there with their fingerprint all the employees, and there's only one unidentified fingerprint. So, in the Texas School Book Depository, we've got Mac Wallace, and his fingerprint shows up. The reason that we get that is there's a researcher named Jay Harrison who had heard that Mac Wallace was involved with this somehow and suspected that maybe they were going to get lucky and that unidentified fingerprint would be his. But there was no way to get the fingerprint of Mac Wallace, except for the fact that he had been arrested for murder in 1951 for shooting the Gulf pro Douglas Kinzer. So the investigator, Jay Harrison, said, well, I wonder if there's a way I can get that. He went to different law enforcement officials, and they said, oh, yeah, you can have it exactly at this date. 35 years after the crime, everything is available. 1996, that researcher goes, and he takes the card with the fingerprint of Mac Wallace, and he matches it to the fingerprint, the unidentified fingerprint found in the Texas School Book Depository. That fingerprint was brought to Nathan Darby, who was a major specialist, had worked for law enforcement for 50 years. And not only that, but he had, with law enforcement and Kodak, developed for law enforcement a way of sharing fingerprints across Kodak equipment. So this guy had all the experience that you needed. He was the ultimate in all of this. And he found a 14-point match to the fingerprint of Malcolm Wallace's left little finger, which is where the fingerprint came from.
I think it's more than 14.
Well, it's 34. It's very interesting because it was reported as 34, but as he went through the channels of how he would submit it to law enforcement, he said, here are the 14 like absolute spot on, and here's like there's another 20 that are indicative, but there's 14 that are just you go to the bank with. And the 12 points are required to make a conviction. So he had 14 in the fingerprint. And so with it, he went ahead and submitted. He didn't know who the fingerprint was from. And he went ahead and did it. Now, Walt Brown was an investigator in that period, a big JFK investigator. And one of these guys who was a deep state researcher, the caliber and the type of which I wish there were around the UFO file. Because if you study these people who studied the JFK assassination, who were the deep state researchers, they understood all the levers about how the government moved about things. And they would never accept, for example, CIA whistleblowers telling them secrets. So that's why we have the kind of sideshow, clown show on the UFO side, because they don't have the investigatory skills of the UFO file, of the deep state researchers. That's just a fact. And it's a missing component. I wish it were there, and I try to bring that factor across in my own work because I think it's crucial. But I will say this about someone like Walt Brown, he could instantly, like no one like Lou Elizondo would survive 2 minutes in a conversation with a guy like that. They just break them down in their counterintelligence, thing by saying, would you work for the government? So if you work for the government currently, and since you have counterintelligence as your expertise, if somebody were to say to you on behalf of the U.S. government, you need to go out and do counterintelligence lying around this UFO topic, would you have to do that as an assignment? And of course, the person would have to say yes. So we would understand that all those counterintelligence CIA people who are going up and saying, oh, there's a UFO threat, and are being featured on all the big podcasts and all the rest of it, that whole thing is being orchestrated. And those people have a job, and, somebody like Elizondo has a job. Mellon's given him a job. The job is use your counterintelligence skills to promote a UFO threat in the public. So people like Brown, you know, if they were in this arena, you know, unfortunately he's passed on now, but in this arena, they would slice and dice the nonsense that we've seen going on. Myself, I just want to say this personally, the people that I learned from by studying their work, like Professor Scott and others, that's why, you know, it's so easy for me to see through the CIA obfuscation and what they're doing. I understand how they operate and how they build psychological operations. So, you know, this idea that, you know, TMZ is like running specials with Corbell and you're going to get the truth. And like, people sent me this thing. And, you know, I can't believe that there could be anyone in my audience who could watch the shows that I do and send me a TMZ Corbell special, you know? So we have problems there because you get to a level of understanding. If you can get to these deeper levels of how the obfuscation of the PSYOP operates, it applies to every different area. So, you know, if it's the presidential assassination, if it's a drug cartel thing, if it's a financial coup, whatever it happens to be, they're going to use a playbook. And the counterintelligence playbook, you're going to need counterintelligence actors for it. When you get around the UFO thing, now that they feel like, okay, you know, we can use this to our benefit, use all the counterintelligence people to go out there and do what? Lie for the government. But their job title entitles them to lie because they're lying on behalf of the government as a counterintelligence agent. So, you know, the thing is, it's the journalism that has to get sharper. There's no question about it. And it's kind of what I've been seeing lately at the open of this year around the drones, around the UFO phony revelations. And remember, the UFO file is real, but the CIA disclosure is not. What I've been seeing is a disgrace, you know, for me when I look at it. And I feel like the people involved don't care, you know, and I think that their main goal is, you know, just to have a talking point and promote these CIA people because the CIA people are in the middle of this media maelstrom. So I think that whole thing has to clean up. Okay, back into the fingerprint story. So Mac Wallace's fingerprint is found in the Texas School Book Depository. It's been verified by fingerprint experts. That opens up the Mac Wallace thing. Now, if anyone wants to say, well, you know, maybe it wasn't Mac Wallace's fingerprint or whatever, it was certified by, you know, one of the best, basically, and subsequently has been. Now, let's go back to the story.
Can I insert something?
Yeah.
I always go back, Nathan Darby. So he said his dying declaration, they matched. That he is so passionate about that in the interview. Think about that. This expert, he's done so many cases. That is not his dying declaration. I love my kids. I love my and it's like my dying declaration. They match.
Right.
That is intense.
Yes, it is. And I think one of the things about Darby too is when they're talking to him, he can't understand how anyone would come back and say that they don't match. He's like, I have too much experience, you know, like I designed Kodak to work with law enforcement. I mean, I know how to read a fingerprint. So it doesn't, you know, he's in the middle of disinformation where they're just trying to discredit it because God help us that Mac Wallace's fingerprint is in there. He's the president's hitman. So that all came out in 2003. This was the gigantic wave around it. And there was, you know, there was all this information that came out. There were LBJ books and there was good information that came out. Later, there were books that came out, let's say over the past 10 years, that try to just focus on LBJ and be like, the CIA wasn't involved. It was just LBJ. No, you can't. You don't have the infrastructure you need for that level of assassination. But to understand his role in it is crucial. If you don't understand the CIA aerospace laying out the foundations for how the assassination should go and using all the aerospace people involved, including Oswald, who, after all, said he was going to work for NASA, to his colleagues at Riley Coffee Company. And it's interesting, too, if you want more of that, many of the specials we've done include Guy Bannister, who's the person who's employing Oswald. The summer before the assassination, Guy Bannister started the UFO file for the FBI and was to the right of Attila the Hun. Why is Oswald the commie working for him? You see, when you realize the amount of UFO fingerprints around the assassination, then, the whole thing starts to open up and we get into experimental spacecraft and that whole piece that goes with it. But where does this story go? Well, they release the information about the fingerprint and it gets blocked, basically. The special that Nigel Turner produces gets blocked in this country. It's still banned. That's a banned documentary. You can find it. But that whole piece about Mac Wallace dusted. And even the JFK researchers who were like, oh, it distracts from the fact that we're ascribing the JFK assassination to the mafia or something. We don't want LBJ involved. And a lot of them were Democrats who didn't want to villainize LBJ. Mm-hmm. This is a problem, too. So we have to understand what we're looking at, in fact, when they find the fingerprint. Remember, there's only one that's unidentified. And Jay Harrison was clever enough to put the Mac Wallace part together and crisscross it. That's evidence. That's one piece of evidence. Now, the second piece of evidence, Billy Celeste's story, his witness testimony about it all. The third piece, of course, all the other stories about Mac Wallace and the fact that Mac Wallace is a convicted killer. Now, I don't think that Mac Wallace was the assassin of President Kennedy. I think that he was instructed to be involved with the plot. And that's the insertion, and there's probably a reason why intelligence had Wallace involved in it. So if you're the CIA and you are looking at assassinating President Kennedy because of his resistance to, playing his role and his trying to dismantle you and smash you into 1,000 pieces, if you're going to replace him with somebody, you're going to need something to hold over their head the entire time. And the thing that you could hold over their head is that one of your people were involved. And he may even have been instructed to leave a fingerprint when you think of it that way. Now, here's an interesting thing. I did tell you that in 1971, strange waves were coming up that looked like a reinvestigation of JFK's assassination may be afoot. And in fact, it did happen in 1975 and 1979 and again in 1992. But it wasn't known then what was going to take place. There were whispers, as I mentioned, about LBJ disintegrating. And his psychiatrists were particularly worried about the fact that the assassination, was haunting him. Now, according to Barr McClellan, everyone in his law firm knew that. And I've had the great privilege to speak with Barr. As a matter of fact, we talked maybe about 7 years ago now. But his book and his work has been very, very solid around, and he, was actually a lawyer in LBJ's firm. So he said that all the people there in the firm at that point in time understood that LBJ was unraveling. And there was this incredible financial bonus available to the psychiatrist who could prevent him from giving up the secret that he was involved or that he knew about it. Because, again, he had made these public statements. So keep all that in mind as we move along here. So Wallace was utilized according to Sol Estes in 17 different murders for LBJ. But those are just the ones that he knows about. And the idea that LBJ would have this streak in him is reinforced by a story that Madeline Brown says, which is at one point, she's living at this house and LBJ comes over to visit and her nanny is there And the nanny sees them in an embrace, and LBJ freaks out. He didn't know that she was there. So then a week later, the nanny disappears, and it causes great distress to Madeline Brown. But as things turn out, she hears from, because she's so connected with the lawyers and other people around LBJ, and that whole scene of Big Oil and all the rest of it, she hears that LBJ had her nanny eliminated because of them seeing them both together.
I didn't know this story.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? And that's when she decided, she had really lost faith in him as a person, but she knew now that the stories about him were true and that he, for political expediency, had murder as part of his MO. So LBJ is different in that sense from a lot of different leaders that we've had in that way. He was very, he had a kind of psychopathic tendency in there. And
tendency?
What he had was the ability to justify, something like murder because, the greater cause of me being president or whatever it happened to be. This is the same kind of justification when he thought, the Kennedys are going to participate in unraveling me from the ticket and maybe I'll go to prison. That's the embarrassment, in my opinion, that he was referring to. Okay, a couple more quotes and then we're on. Now, what happened to Mac Wallace? Whatever happened to Mac? And remember, he came to prominence because jury returns murder indictment against Wallace in Kinzer shooting. So the jury decided this guy in 1951 was guilty of killing the golf pro because so many people had seen him. And the story about how he goes in and shoots Douglas Kinzer is very strange too, because he goes in and he asks him for all these things. He's like, I want candy, I want this, I want that, I want cigarettes. And Kinzer starts to get suspicious about what's going on. And then there it is that our friend Wallace shoots him. Now, check this out. Wallace was going out with Josepha Johnson. He was dating LBJ's sister, who was an alcoholic and a sex addict, and she had quite a little background. We don't have time in this show to go into her life, but boy, that was something else. And what he figured out was that she was going out with Douglas Kinzer, the golf pro, and the golf pro had hit up LBJ for money, apparently because he had heard things from Josepha Johnson that were very scandalous, and he thought, I can make some real bank here. That's why Mac Wallace gets put into action, to blow away the threat. Now, LBJ will use him later to get rid of Henry Marshall. So there's a track record here of Mac Wallace's dark deeds for LBJ. But what is it that LBJ does with him? He sets him up with a high-end secret aerospace defense contractor job.
Right after he gets, he doesn't get acquitted. He's guilty.
He gets a suspended sentence, and what's interesting is the jury can't believe that the judge, they're like, what they were debating was, should he get the electric chair or should he get life in prison? And 11 of them said electric chair and 1 said life in prison. But nonetheless, he was guilty and they left it to the judge to sentence. And he said, 5 years and suspended sentence, you're free. Now, the person who showed up with him, though, is someone named John Cofer, who was the lawyer, LBJ's lawyer in that period. And LBJ has him sending reports back on a daily basis of what's happening in the case. He needs to make sure his man doesn't go to prison. Now, it's interesting, too, about LBJ is that Cofer will become the lawyer of Billy Sol Estes. So he's representing Sol Estes before these hearings and things. And one thing I'll say about that situation is, obviously, LBJ said, don't worry, I have this under control. You're set. You're not going to do any jail time. But Sol Estes ends up in prison. That's why I think all of this comes out. All right. How are we doing on time here? All right, so I'll read one more thing and then we're off to your questions.
Are you going to bring in the gold at all?
Oh, boy. Yeah, I might do a separate gold episode.
You're going to have to allude to it.
Okay. What else you got?
David Termina, so do you think Wallace fired the, quote, magic bullet from the 6th floor of the book depository? Still not the headshot, most likely.
No, the headshot came from the front, and he was in the Texas School Book Depository. I actually think Wallace was up there setting things up. There's a very strange story hanging out back there that, and there's so many odd stories in relation to the Kennedy assassination. But one story that I always found unusual is that Oswald was seen in the company of someone who looked like Mac Wallace, but Oswald seemed completely drugged out. So I
When
thought
was this?
that was supposed to be on the day of the assassination.
I've never heard this story.
Yeah.
Where's this from?
It comes, there's a whole different thing there. I'm not going to shift the show into
Okay.
that mode now, but it is interesting, and I will expand on it more. I'm not sure if it's viable, but it is interesting nonetheless. Now, there are two witness statements that are viable of someone seeing someone come out of the back of the Texas School Book Depository with a crew cut and glasses, which is exactly what Mac Wallace had. So that's remarkable. And when you think about it, the location itself and the strange things of the crime, for example, the elevator halting in the middle of all this, so that when the police get to the building 90 seconds after the shooting, the elevator won't take them up to the 6th floor because it's not responding. It's open somewhere. That's always been an oddity in all of it. Marion Baker, who comes into the Texas School Book Depository, he finds Oswald in the coffee room, and it's only 90 seconds after the shooting. And there were already people on the stairs, so they didn't see Oswald running up and down stairs. So he was on the 2nd floor. That's a fact. So therefore, someone else was up there causing a distraction, maybe firing a warning shot and planting the rifle, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I think Wallace's job was. And I think that Wallace was working with an intelligence agency group who were working with LBJ. Now, it's interesting because I mentioned Hunt earlier. And of course, Hunt came out with a deathbed confession laying it all at LBJ's steps, but he said LBJ had worked with the CIA to assassinate President Kennedy. And if you really go into that testimony, he talks about the CIA people that he worked with. And Cord Meyer is the CIA official that he says mapped out the assassination with President Kennedy. So, that it's LBJ with Cord Meyer and the CIA working in that role. I actually, in my own mind, looking at the personalities involved, see that LBJ was somebody who was set up and revved up and knew that the CIA wanted to take out President Kennedy, and that he offered himself basically as the one who could give them what they wanted. Because in fact, he says to the generals as soon as he gets into office, I'll give you the war in Vietnam. I know you guys want to stand up to China and do all this stuff, but you have to do it in a way where I can be reelected, so you can't get me in trouble till then. And so he is this kind of deal maker in the middle. And what he ends up with, let's think about it. He ends up with the presidency. He has eliminated his enemy, President Kennedy, and he ends up, he's serving the military-industrial complex, big oil, and all those people are very happy with him. But he's serving this other system in the background, and this is the one that does not get talked about, which is his role with developing NASA, one, his role around the UFO file. He did a whole thing about a UFO study in the Senate. James McDonald was the scientist who was very deep on the UFO file. He was a friend of LBJ's. LBJ was getting all that information around the UFO file. So we need to keep that in mind when we get around the figure of LBJ, that he's deeply involved with it. And the person that he's hooked up with and close friends with is D.H. Byrd. Well, Senator Harry Byrd, there are all these pictures, and I've shown them before. I think I have them here now, of LBJ kissing the hand of Senator Byrd, You know, how do you get a senator to get his hand kissed by a president? I think it shows you the power of the birds in the middle of all this. But LTV is the company that D.H. Byrd takes from being completely broke before the assassination. He invests $3 million, and that $3 million is worth $55 million by 1965 money, because suddenly they're going to need all of these things, all of these aerospace devices to fight the war in Vietnam, and there we have our friend. So we need to keep that in mind, that there's an aspect here lurking in the background, which has to do with aerospace. And even when we're looking at Mac Wallace, you've got Ling Temco Vout. And that is LTV. And what is LTV, after all? An aerospace defense company. So these are the factors that are involved, and sitting in the middle of it all is this aerospace UFO fingerprint. And with that, Miss Olivia, I am handing it over to you, although I'm going to insert things along the way.
Sounds good. T-Mix says, LBJ guilty of murder. Nixon said that he wanted to be president, but he would not kill for it, but LBJ did.
He did. He made that quote to an aide, and he was like, we both wanted to be president, but I wasn't willing to kill for it. I think that with LBJ, it's such a sense of corruption. It's like almost like a split personality thing, where he can convince one half of his personality that he's doing the right thing. So probably some psychologist out there could tell us exactly what the complex is. I studied psychology, but when I get around the LBJ thing, what I'm feeling the most from him is, he feels that Kennedy makes him secondary. As a matter of fact, he tries to convince Tip O'Neill famously when they're nominating Kennedy not to do it, even though he knows. And he says, look, I know you have to support him on the first ballot, but throw your support to me in the second ballot. We'll get rid of this kid. And Tip O'Neill said, oh, you're not aware of the long arm of the Kennedys. Forget it. There's not going to be a second ballot, you joker. And there wasn't a second ballot, of course. So LBJ underestimated the power, the force of Kennedy. And a lot of that has to do with Joe Kennedy, who is, the same kind of wheeler dealer in the background. A couple of quick things before we head into questions. One, this is McClellan trying to demonstrate how Henry Marshall committed suicide. Okay. He's supposed to have taken the rifle like that and shot himself 5 times. Right? I mean, it's ultimately impractical. It's not going to happen. I want to say this about Henry Marshall too, which is, there are people, sometimes it seems like when we talk about these things that the government is just a bunch of ruthless people. But think about Marshall himself, who risked his life and stood up to the entire machine. And yes, in the grand scheme, LBJ, did get Mac Wallace involved to take him out. But if you think about it, it is through his standing up that ultimately LBJ is somewhat unwound to us. So that's a hero's bravery there. And he would not take the bribes. What's interesting is that day before the assassination, there's a very interesting story about how for the next day, LBJ, what he tries to do is he takes Kennedy aside over and over again and says, I want you to have Senator Yarborough in the car, and I want John Connally in my car. Now, this is very interesting because they are enemies, but Yarborough is a liberal Democrat, so what's the problem? Yarborough has always seen through LBJ and the schemes, and he knows what he's involved in. But it's interesting because he wants Yarborough in the death car with Kennedy the next day so they can get rid of his enemies there. And Connally is his hand-picked puppet. And what he ends up doing is making him governor. As soon as he leaves the Senate, he puts everything into place for Connally to become governor. Now, when Kennedy puts Connally in the front seat with him and right in front of him, and he's in the main car. This is a big, big problem for LBJ because he realizes, they're going to be shooting up that car and Connolly's going to get it like Kennedy's going to get it. So what he has that morning in the hotel when they come in from Fort Worth, he has a fight with President Kennedy that Kennedy's wife, Jackie, says, I have never heard them yell at each other like that, but I've never heard my husband have to yell that loud to fight off LBJ, basically. He had to scream at this guy. And LBJ was flipping out on him, and they had the worst fight that they'd ever had. Now, LBJ realized that if Connolly's in that front car, and Connolly is part of this, that he's going to lose one of his main men. Now, he probably did not tell Connolly about being assassinated and that Kennedy was going to get assassinated. But you can see that he's looking there ahead and saying, this is how I'm going to get unraveled in the assassination. That's why he fights so hard of the seating placement. I don't think it's just because he hates Ralph Yarborough, which he certainly did, but Yarborough himself continued right up to his dying day to say things about LBJ and remark on his incredible background and dirty deals in the background. By the way, Cliff Carter, that is a picture of Cliff Carter, who was the aide that Billy Sol Estes said LBJ made him order Malcolm Wallace to be involved in the assassination. And we have another shot of them here. Okay, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Boober Fighter said, we have to face it that Connolly milked the JFK incident for all it was worth for the rest of his life. Well, what do you think about the quote, oh my God, they're going to kill us all?
I think that certainly Connolly was an inside player, and he knew that Johnson had designs on the presidency. I don't know if he knew, I don't believe that he knew Kennedy was going to get assassinated. And the fact, remember what happens is that Connolly turns against Johnson in later life, and he becomes the Democrats for Nixon guy, and he becomes the Treasury Secretary for our friend Nixon. So that's a Republican ticket. He moves away from that whole thing. And in 1966, there's a quote from LBJ that is recounted by his chief of staff when he says, I should have kept a closer eye on Connolly. So, no, they don't have a soft relationship after that. I think that Connolly figures out, whatever you were up to, you put me right in the middle of, and I got shot. And he could have been killed, for sure.
Bardo says, I've always thought Connolly was holding his hat, desperately trying to signal the shooters it was him and not Yarborough. I've never heard anybody say that. That's an interesting point.
Wow. Yeah, that is very interesting. Well, Yarborough's, he's right behind Kennedy in the follow-up car. LBJ, it's interesting because there's a story about LBJ ducking before any of the shots got fired. And I find that very interesting. I'm not surprised at all. I think that LBJ was in full knowledge of the assassination and was a part of it. There's no question about it. I don't think that he orchestrated the whole thing by himself. The thing was concocted by the CIA Aerospace piece. And then, in fact, LBJ was connected to both, but he's especially connected to Aerospace. And with Byrd in the heart of all this thing, there's a remarkable Antarctica twist that I've tried to suggest in my own work. And the reason for that is because D.H. Byrd owns the Texas School Book Depository, but also the person that President Kennedy is going to meet at the Trade Mart to have this major speech with is the person who went first to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd in 1928. Stayed there for 2 years. And that's Lloyd Berkner, the physicist, who was in charge of the Robertson panel, the first major UFO study. So those things are there. There's no way around them. The question is, what do those factors mean? But that Byrd was involved because he owned the central station from where they were going to launch the Patsy and all the rest of it. You needed to have those people well positioned. And if Mac Wallace's fingerprint was in the Texas School Book Depository, and he worked for LTV, which Byrd owned. It meant that Byrd has a double signature in the crime, which is Malcolm Wallace and the Texas School Book Depository. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 185, the JFK coup, CIA, Aerospace, new evidence revealed. We've been talking a great deal here about Billy Sol Estes and his revelations left to his grandson, which we got part of the transcript of, and the whole show was done. And Shane Stevens is the grandson. He put the information out on the Alex Jones show on Tuesday, and it is a remarkable revelation. Now, I mentioned that there might be a way to use this revelation to open up the UFO file, and I'll tell you how we could do that in a nutshell. Here's how it could be done. So we know there are all these false UFO CIA people, and they're going to have congressional hearings, and they're going to whitewash people like Burchett and all that stuff. They're going to say, "Did you really see a UFO?" And they're going to say, "Yes, sir." And Lou Elizondo is going to be like, "Oh, I've suffered the slings and arrows, but I'm going to get this UFO truth out." All CIA balderdash. But if you reopen the Kennedy case with the new information of opening up the CIA files and the revelations of Shane Stevens, Billy Sol Estes tapes of Clint Carter, the main aide to LBJ, you could open it up under the auspices of what were they hiding, what was behind the assassination. And if you do that, you could open up the fact of all the testimony around the UFO file involved in the Kennedy assassination. That's the way to get at the real UFO file, and not the sideshow of, "Oh, I saw an egg," You're going to get a lot of "I saw an egg" sideshows. That's just the way it's going to go. And no matter how many tattoos, Elizondo or Corbell has, it's not going to make any difference to the authenticity of the things that they're saying, because Corbell is the TV sideshow for TMZ and all that stuff, and Elizondo is the CIA counterintelligence whitewash. And they're trying to make them appeal to this, bro culture, when in fact both of them have contempt for, our own honesty and our own intelligence. So they're both playing a role. And I think what's more important, I don't worry about clowns like Corbell and stuff, but the Elizondo, Mellon, Palantir, that whole influence thing and how that is coming in here with Teal, that's extremely bothersome. So I think that you could use these tapes along with the newly opened files that we could get from the CIA as soon as President Trump is inaugurated. You could use that to force a new investigation, and you could make the real UFO file part of that investigation. That's how you get to the truth. If somebody like Burchett and all those people who may want to look at the real stuff for sure, get to it that way, because then you'll have real people to deal with, and you'll have a real issue to deal with, which is the reason ultimately why President Kennedy was assassinated was over the UFO file, that exotic technology. It's still the sprawling piece in the middle of it. That's why you can have drones hanging around in the skies and UAPs and all the rest of it, and nobody explains what's going on there. Because the exotic technology now, they have the ability to roll it out without any permission, apparently. What group's doing that, huh? These are the things you could do. And that's why the breakthrough around the Mac Wallace information with Sol Estes, I think, is incredibly significant. And it's a great opening for combining that. Now you need the George Joannetti's files. Yes.
David Termina, DJ, LTV had a very successful rocket program called Scout, of which a number of them were labeled Blue Scout, launched in the years just prior to the assassination. John Matthews says, what will be the fallout for the aerospace industry / CIA if they are shown to be complicit in the assassination?
Well, it's very important. And some people would say that, if it's over 60 years ago, what kind of impact would it have now? I'll tell you that it does on a number of levels, because it shows a larger plan that's been building up underneath the public facade of the government. And the whole point is, this is interesting because this is uniquely American, if this could be taken on, because you can't, we talk about these other countries like Russia and things like that. You're not going to get this kind of openness in a different culture. You can get it in America. There are tools inside of the government as part of the Constitution, as part of our legal system that could bring some of this to light. So, in my sense of looking at this, it's a way, they talk about make America great again. Well, what was it that happened that really took the Soviet Union down? Well, Gorbachev came forward with glasnost, which was a whole openness policy. And while it unraveled the Soviet Union, the corrupt aspects of the Soviet Union, it made for a better world, ultimately. And Russia was able to rebuild themselves dramatically. So they dealt with their past in one sense. And even Khrushchev had to go back and admit the crimes of Stalin. So I do see, the consideration level of, well, if we admit that the CIA assassinated their own president and that the Aerospace group was behind it, what does that do to the culture, the fabric of the culture? Well, I think leaving the question unanswered is worse. That's the ultimate answer. But also, you can get a much better handle on the transparency of what's going on. You could actually return the government to a constitutional form of government by getting past that level and unraveling that corruption. There's no doubt in my mind that that could take place. It would take a tremendous effort. But if you're in the middle of efforts to unmask things like, the COVID op, and the pharmaceutical takeover and things of this nature, central to all that, you can't really get at the center of history until you unravel the Kennedy assassination. And it's amazing, I've run across some researchers, and I've had them on the show and things like that. We'll talk about things, if they're into like the Maxwell Epstein case or whatever. And then some of them you get around the Kennedy assassination. And I remember one guest in particular, and I won't say her name, but, she had all this experience around deep state research. And she said, I never looked into the Kennedy assassination. I don't know anything about it. Well, people are interested in different things for sure. But if you want to understand American deep state corruption, you can't, like the Kennedy assassination, not only is it a historical snapshot of the forces and the interplay of those forces on the secret side, but since they were triumphant in the Kennedy assassination and removed a sitting president, then, those forces just continued to grow. I mean, what happened to the CIA? They got their own Air Force, and they're bigger than ever. They control more than ever. They almost got us, and they may get us into a nuclear war with Russia still. So I certainly hope not. But, and you have all these people who are apologists for the CIA. That's tough because they say, yeah, well, the CIA had problems back in the day, but now they're great. Well, we just found out that they tried to assassinate Julian Assange. How great can they be? So, no, you could unravel and you could use it as the foundation and the basis of a more perfect union. You could use it as the foundation of a better constitutional republic, which is, after all, what we're supposed to be striving for in the grand scheme of things. And you could be a city on a hill in that vocabulary. The thing is that that should be the heart of what a civilization aspires to. And it's funny, I think we had more of that ideal even in the period that we're talking about, where all these terrible things were going on. The hearts and the ideal of people were in a totally different place. Yes.
News Drifter, question: would exposing the Aerospace group corruption of the past help bring the current corruption of the tech oligarchs to greater visibility?
Yeah, there's big problems. Well, we're using certain language like tech and aerospace, but what is it that's behind the whole thing? So when I talk about X Protect, they protect the technology, the UFO technology. they're a group in the background. They're operating there, but they've been there for years. So how does a group like that figure into something like this? Ex-Protect is certainly part of the JFK assassination. Whenever you get into that shady corridor between the aerospace, secret aerospace, and the intelligence groups, that's where you find Ex-Protect, because they discovered something that they don't want to share with the general public. And that's been the problem around the UFO file for this whole period, because when we see things that are far beyond our capability, and we have seen them for decades, and they're not explained within the context of the technology that we have or that we understand in the public, then you have two separate systems of government going on. So it's not to say a government wouldn't have the right to a certain amount of secrecy in relation to how they conduct foreign relations, for example. But that level of secrecy where a small group exploits an advanced technology and awareness and has a secret science building on itself in the background, that's how you get the schizophrenic society that it is. That is the old serf master, master-slave relationship. And unfortunately, what's even worse, I mean, that setup is bad enough. But what's even worse is the people in charge, just like when we saw Zuckerberg trying to pretend that he's for free speech and things like that. These are undeveloped people. These are not people who are on a moral crusade of any kind. I don't think they have any morals. I don't think they have any internal compass except their own driving success. And when they get together, I think they're herded into this idea that, there are these elite people who care for the planet and that they should be the ones who survive. And don't worry, they have their nuclear bunkers ready for them. And so I think that we have an upside down leadership in corporate terms. Certainly people like Bezos and Zuckerberg, I don't know them personally, but I don't get anything. There's not that ethical sacrifice that you get in a person like Robert Kennedy Sr. and Jr. You get a totally different feeling from these people. So, and I don't get healthy vibes from Musk either, I'll be honest. He may have switched in order to become the focal point of how that big technological giant can be in the right with one half of the population. But I don't buy Elon Musk and his, we saw that in a fit of temper when people were calling him out over the H-1B situation, he started downgrading and silencing accounts. You're a CEO of a company. You can't do that, So it shows kind of immature, undeveloped, really, these aren't leaders. And I think that what we're looking for in the culture are leaders. That's why it'll be very interesting with the incoming administration, because there's a lot of leadership types in that administration. And I think we could get, a lot of them are ready for this kind of transparency. And the question is, are these other people, the tech oligarchs, are they going to be a drag? Are they going to actually take their approval ratings down of these people? Are they going to be a distraction? And so far, I've seen that they could be more of a liability, in the grand scheme of things. Yes.
Bob Crandall, LBJ 50-year delayed secret UFO letter out this year? And Nightline Legal, is LBJ's letter X a confession?
Oh, really good point. Look, when I first started the X series, I had all this information available about the LBJ X letter, which is 55 pages, that he put away as a time capsule in 1973, before he died, to be opened 50 years later. And it's interesting because a lot of strange things happened along the way. After President Nixon died, someone in that outfit of the LBJ library decided, oh, you know what? This is actually what it's about. It's about the fact that he was tapping Richard Nixon and that Nixon had said some unsavory stuff, negotiated with the enemy, Vietnam, to delay conditions until he got in, or, And I'm sure LBJ and Nixon tried to blackmail each other often, so it doesn't surprise me that people thought that. But they opened up the letter, they read a couple of pages, and then those pages had to be instantly classified, and then they locked the letter up. Now, everyone thinks, okay, well, they opened the letter up in 1994, so after Nixon died, what's the big deal? No, they read 2 out of 55 pages, so 53 of the pages are still there, and the first 2 pages were never released. So nobody knows what's in that X letter that LBJ put aside or why he wanted it opened in 50 years, but it's obviously something deep there. And I call those stealth archives. What happens is a lot of these presidents, just like the Nixon time capsule, they want to have their role in the development of the UFO file piece spelled out for history, but they don't want it, you know, they're under orders not to let that information out early or to let our adversaries use it against us, whatever it happens to be. And so the stealth archives sit there. The JFK records are the biggest example of stealth archives. I know they're there. You know they're there. They contain all the secrets relating in some ways to the CIA assassination of the president. But we can't see them, right? So they're stealth archives. I know they're there. You know they're there, but I can't put my hands on them. Now, we know, and we played out the whole thing about Napolitano and Trump and how Trump said, if you knew it was in there, you couldn't release it. So we'll see. But Trump made the pledge with RFK on that stage. And it's interesting because, you know, RFK Jr. is a major factor. There's like a weird driving reminder in his very existence that his father and his uncle were assassinated. And the assassination of the Kennedys is the absolute splintering point for the culture. And in that splintered point, we have all these false leaders sitting on top because the thing got splintered back then and it wasn't explained. So sometimes, you know, they do these different documentaries and things you'll watch, and people who come out there and these kind of, you know, white liberals come out and say like, oh, you know, we did these great things. We marched and we did all this stuff. And, you know, I'm so glad that we changed everything. And what I think to myself, based on my research, maybe it's cynical, is, you know, oh, there was a war that took place there. And guess what? Our side, you know, you lost. And what took over was something else. So what they gave people were these soft, you know, little victories on the top, like, under the guise of, hey, you know, feminism or whatever it was. But the deeper culture, the thing that America was aspiring to be, got snuffed out in the assassination of the 2 Kennedys. And this other thing held the power. And I haven't seen them relinquish any power in that regard. You know, some people, someone had written to me recently, how can I put this? They basically said that things had, you know, everything had changed because Trump had gone in because, you know, I supported Trump very heavily during the election. There's no question. You know, the alternative was oblivion. And what they said to me was everything, you know, that was the last chance for the deep state. And they lost, and now we're all set. And this is, you know, a pretty kind of well-known person. And I said, well, no, there's no, you know, look around in the Senate. Who got in the Senate? Who's asking, who's going to be grilling Tulsi Gabbard? Adam Schiff, one of the worst representations of political demagoguery. He's right there in those Senate committees. You have a 4 or 5 congressional seat majority. You know, that's thin. You do have a few senators. You've got 53 versus 47. That's good. But you have never Trumpers in there too. That could be a problem. So no, the thing is right on the balance of a razor's edge. There's no question about it. Go ahead. What do you got?
Okay.
And I hope that's not taken cynically, but you see my point. It's sort of like, no, we've got this kind of reprieve. Let's see if we can use it to really restore the constitutional rule in the country. And if we can kind of open up the madness that overtook these governments with the COVID op. But instead, when you see things like the UFO threat piece being, amplified through the use of drones and things like that, I mean, it looks to me like they're just doubling and tripling down all over the place. Yes.
Happy Hermit 3D. Has DJ looked into the Bird bloodline? And David Tormina, it turns out that the Bird family were among the earliest settlers of what would become Cape Girardeau, Missouri. D.H. Bird's father was raised there.
Oh, it's very interesting. I know that Pocahontas is in the background there, and there's a whole rich history about the Birds, which I wouldn't do justice to at the end of this show. But yeah, there's a lot. We have talked about some of it before. I do think that Pocahontas is a very interesting and special story in relation to all that. But the Birds, they run the political dynasty in Virginia. That's their kind of native place. And Admiral Byrd, D.H. Byrd, they influence the world dramatically in different ways. But there's a big secret in relation to discovery that took place around Antarctica. And I think we've only scratched the surface of it, but it's almost like everyone can kind of sense that the secret involving Antarctica is huge. The question is, why are so many Antarctica figures sitting there in the middle of the Kennedy story? And why, in the case of D.H. Byrd, his kind of celebratory move after the Kennedy assassination was to go where? He went to Antarctica after pretending to be hanging out in Africa during the assassination. I wanted to mention this about our friend Byrd. Are you ready? He was always sending LBJ boxes of fruit. Now, LBJ would, show up at the VP mansion there, and there's all this fruit waiting for him from D.H. Byrd. My guess is those are instructions. I don't think that they were very interested in sending him fruit. So I found that particularly strange, shall we say. And I think because you mentioned it, I am going to, let's see if I can insert a little flash of the gold thing. Oh, here's an interesting little side swipe on Malcolm Wallace. Are you ready? I wanted to make sure we got this in there before we wrapped up. And then we'll take more of your questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 185, JFK Coup, CIA Aerospace. New evidence revealed, and it is quite remarkable. Billy Sol Estes' grandson has come forward with tapes of Cliff Carter discussing the assassination of President Kennedy and LBJ's involvement in it through his henchman, Malcolm Wallace. Okay. Very strange. Later, as he escalated the war in 1965 and thereafter, Johnson told McNamara, "I want you to go out and kill a bunch of people." That's a quote. No one in the inner circles should have been surprised. On Christmas Eve 1963, a month after the assassination, Johnson promised the military that he would pursue a war in Vietnam vigorously. So he reassured the Joint Chiefs, just get me elected, Johnson said famously, and then you can have your war. It seems apparent that Lyndon Johnson knew exactly what was expected of him, which was, as historian Stanley Carno wrote, the deeper military plunge. On January 1964, settled into office, D.H. Byrd, the defense contractor who owned the Texas Schoolbook Depository on the day of the Kennedy assassination, was awarded a contract to build a jet bomber from Johnson's 1965 budget before the budget was approved by Congress. February saw Ling Temco Vought being awarded a contract to build an A-7 Corsair II, a plane that would see service in Vietnam. Mac Wallace, now in California, was still working for Byrd. Ling Electronics, which employed Mac, was a subsidiary of TEPCO. Barry Goldwater's charge of hypocrisy against Johnson is illuminated by a telephone conversation between Johnson and Senator Russell. May 24th, 1964. What do you think about the Vietnam thing? Johnson asked. It's the damn worst mess I ever saw, Russell said. That's the way I've been feeling for 6 months, Johnson says. Russell suggests pulling out. Johnson invokes a military man he knows who has 6 kids. Just thinking of this man being sent to Vietnam, Johnson says, makes chills run down my back. By the end of the conversation, Russell, an honest man, says, I see no terminal date. But the interesting thing there is all about Temco. And that's an excerpt from Joan Mellon's book. Joan Mellon did a book on Mac Wallace to try to debunk the whole fingerprint thing and be like, no, look at the CIA side. And I understand how people get caught up in that. But she's done good research in any case on Mac Wallace and all the rest because she wanted to get to the bottom of the whole thing. But she doesn't believe that Wallace was involved at all. Now, gold. I will mention this much of gold, and then we'll do an episode about this gold. And I don't know if Dr. Farrell's still out there, but he might find this interesting. I was thinking of him when I came across this. There was a method to Johnson's acquiring ranch properties, not only in New Mexico, but in Old Mexico as well. In the waning days of his vice presidency, Johnson had learned from a boyhood friend from Johnson City, Dick Richardson, a former U.S. Army officer, about a treasure of gold bars and pure gold, some dating to the Spanish colonial period, and others of more recent vintage. The trove was said to be hidden in caves of Victorio Peak, a small mountain in the Hembrio Basin, on leased government land in the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. That's UFO Test Central. They test other things too. The person who had discovered the treasure originally was one Milton Ernest Doc Noss, who was later murdered by a man named Charlie Ryan of Alice, Texas, home territory of George Parr. Richardson had learned about the treasure from Doc Noss. On June 5th, 1963, Johnson, along with President Kennedy himself, visited White Sands ostensibly to view a demonstration of Nike, Hercules, Pershing, Talos, and Zeus missiles. By helicopter, they traveled to Victorio Peak. Kennedy said, I'm interested in gold artifacts found in the caverns. I'm interested in gold artifacts found in the caverns. Kennedy was interested in the gold artifacts. This belongs to all of us, Johnson said. This is our treasure, and we have control of it all. Once he was president, Johnson began to extract the gold, ordering Attorney General Robert Kennedy to help him organize a military escort to handle the gold that would be taken to his ranch. According to a former U.S. Marine source, Hugh James Huggins, John Clarence, co-author of an extensive study of the story of the Victorio Peak treasure and its fate, identifies a B-24 pilot. All this was illegal. Stored at Victorio Peak were also World War II contraband, such as 2 wooden crates of Russian fine china, coins. In the mix were also old helmets, lances, and swords that seemed to have come from an era of the conquistadors. A witness named Lloyd Gorman Tucker, a CIA asset and LBJ friend, there's your CIA LBJ connection, witnessed Johnson himself opening one of the crates. Tucker admitted to carrying a box of the Russian china to her car for Lady Bird Johnson. Tucker was an expert in handling, mining, smelting, and refining gold and had traveled the world in that capacity. He held a gold license issued by the Treasury Department. Among them, helping to remove the gold was also a group of investors calling themselves Expeditions Unlimited.
Investors.
Among them was Johnson supporter Clint Murchison Jr. Years later, Tucker would report that he had witnessed underground bunkers at the LBJ Ranch in Texas, presumably where the gold had been stored. And then later, he goes on to say Johnson was to remove 6 million troy ounces of gold bullion from the Nos treasure. Maybe somebody out there can give me a ballpark on 6 million troy ounces and the value of them in 1965. I think that there's a lot there. And I also think that Kennedy being interested in the artifacts there is quite fascinating. And that shows up in a lot of the Hot Zone reporting about Kennedy and his interest in ancient artifacts. So the gold bars aspect in relation to what LBJ was doing, he views all this stuff with Kennedy. Kennedy's assassinated, and then he's rolling the stuff to his ranch in underground bunkers. I mean...
After saying, this is ours?
This is ours, yeah. Mm-hmm. Amazing. It is remarkable. So...
Scott Lewis says it's 17 billion.
Oh, incredible. Well, see, think about it. If $17 billion was involved... You know, I mean, you start to look at LBJ's situation and he's thinking to himself, I'm going to prison with Billy Sol Estes, or I cooperate in the JFK assassination and have some of my people involved in it, and I can carry on, be president, and also get $17 billion worth of gold that Kennedy's also interested in. How he got Robert Kennedy to help him is strange, and I don't know how that part of it worked. But I do feel that the gold thing is interesting. That whole aspect around the gold piece is just a strange background piece that, you know, when you think about it, if there are real discoveries, whether it's conquistador gold or, you know, this whole idea of the secret system of finance and how that gold would feed into that system and can be left off the books. And I heard for some of this that, you know, LBJ hid some of it in Mexico and took trips to Mexico, which as president, you're not supposed to do, you know, off the cuff. You're not supposed to do that off the books. And, you know, there's actually, it's illegal even to travel, that way. So there's something very strange in that piece of the story, but I bet there's a lot about LBJ that we don't know about exactly along this line. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Do we know what happened to that gold?
No, it's interesting because, I mean, the story opens up, and it depends on which version of it you believe. But one thing that we do know, supposedly, that one of these guys had to say about the gold is that I picked it up and it says the Marshall killer. That's obviously not the page. One thing we do know about the gold is that supposedly Johnson accumulated 110,000 acres of land in Chihuahua, Mexico, and all in the service of extracting gold from Victorio Peak. As president and after, he removed 6 million troy ounces of gold. And now the claim here is interesting. It says in the late fall of 1964, after he was elected to the presidency, Johnson began to remove gold bars from Victorio Peak. He had the gold flown from Mexico to the United States. He made 4 secret trips to Chihuahua, charging the Department of Defense for the equipment needed to remove the gold. The gold was resmelted in Chihuahua, then it traveled to Europe and Switzerland and reappeared, are you ready, as currency.
What kind of currency?
Well, I can't say that I could not probably lay out the entire thing here, but you can be sure there's a gold episode coming up in relation to this. And so that's a little bit of X-Series gold for you right there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series 185. It's the JFK coup, CIA aerospace evidence revealed, 1963, 2025. Billy Sol Estes, the Texas swindler, as it were, worth over $500 million in 1960. Mac Wallace, the philosophy professor / hitman / defense contractor at LBJ's behest, whose fingerprint was found in the Texas School Book Depository. And finally, Bobby Baker, who had not only set up this incredible bribe scheme, but had organized a call girl ring in the Senate in order to blackmail high-level politicians. Sure, he goes to prison. Sure, our friend Sol Estes goes to prison. But LBJ avoided prison, and he avoided prison by cooperating in the assassination of President Kennedy. Yes.
Jason T. May, do you think Berkner had any inkling or knowledge or suspicion of the coup, i.e. the Byrd connection?
Well, the fact is that I regard Lloyd Berkner, who I did a full documentary on. It's the JFK, The Final Speech documentary. This is the figure that Kennedy was going to meet at the Trade Mart to give the speech. And I've described the pomp and circumstance of that speech. A helicopter was going to fly in a flag that had flown over the White House, and JFK was going to hand the flag to Berkner. And according to Berkner's letter after the assassination, immediately after, President Kennedy was going to make a speech that would have staggering national and international implications. So I don't think just dedicating a science center in Texas is going to have international implications. There's the weird story about Berkner, which is, this is quite amazing, but you can't get around it. After the assassination in 1966, he has a meeting with James McDonald, who is deep, deep scientist in the UFO file, one of the best. And they have a meeting for 4 hours in a house in Dallas. And a Johnson aide is there. And our friend McDonald records the entire proceeding, quite interestingly. What takes place is he's got 4 hours of tape there. A couple weeks later, Berkner goes to speak at this think tank in Washington, D.C., and he goes and has a fast food burger. He goes up to give his speech at this think tank and drops dead. Now, McDonald will unravel, and they presume he committed suicide, although that story is quite absurd. The first place, he shows up with a gunshot wound at a hospital, and his wife visited him, and he's recovering. And then the wife leaves, and they find him 5 miles away off the highway. So McDonald got too close to these things on the UFO file. He was a victim of the X-Protect group. And Berkner, who I really feel was more of an X-Share character than an X-Protect character, although he operated with both worlds. This is somebody who knew a great deal because he's deep in the UFO file. He sets up the IGY. He gets Byrd to go back to Antarctica one last time. That is Admiral Byrd. And he also, I think, is conducting a certain amount of UFO espionage by inviting the Russian scientists onto the International Geophysical Year. There's something rather dramatic about that. And it's interesting because it's 1958, and this is the year that Edgar Cayce pinpoints as a major change for humanity. And I can't help but look around at the things that were going on in 1958, like the launching of satellites, the discovery of the laser, and the International Geophysical Year, and go back to that Cayce reading pointing out that specific date. So, yeah, we're in deep, deep territory. All right, the last couple of questions, Miss Olivia.
Well, interesting. This ties into the gold, I think, a little bit. News Drifter says, I would think the Kennedys would more likely use the Marshall investigation evidence to blackmail Johnson off the ticket to preserve appearances and make it easier for him to say yes. That might be true, but then the gold. The gold is like a wild card.
It is. It is. Well, it's interesting because LBJ is interested in all the wealth, and Kennedy's interested in the artifacts, but they're both gold. Obviously, there's something big hanging out right beneath the surface of that story. And, you know, if there was so much knowledge about LBJ having 17 billion in gold from this, then, you know, wouldn't there have been some kind of larger story, prosecution, whatever have you? What's pretty odd, and what I can tell you, it's a preview of the upcoming episode on this, but apparently Nixon had an interest in this as well. So there's something strange about the gold thing there, especially since Nixon's the one who took us off the gold standard.
How would Nixon have known about it?
Well, it's interesting. How did they know about it? So, you know, there's a deep story hanging out, I think, in the middle of this
How
gold
are you
story.
going to find out?
I have my sources. I'm going to look up. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Fantastic group in the Ideas Room asking fantastic questions. It's a deep, deep topic. I want to tell you this before we wind down this episode with your last couple of questions. The Mac Wallace story around the Texas School Book Depository is pretty fascinating. And if there are a lot of indications that Wallace was involved in the plot. By the way, he was an incredible sharpshooter, even though I don't think he needed even to take a shot on that particular day. He just needed to be part of the plot. And but his involvement in literally the fact that his boss is Link Temko-Vout, who owns the Texas School Book Depository, and, you know, that after the assassination, D.H. Byrd and LBJ are seen having a grand old time at a football game. You know, there's a lot of very interesting openings in all of this. But I think the dramatic shutdown of the fingerprint story in 2003, along with the Guilty Men episode of the Men Who Killed Kennedy series on the History Channel, which was done by Nigel Turner, an English director who had to actually go into hiding. I think that there's something powerful there in the middle of that. And so I want people to be aware that 2003 may have been a turning point, that it took 22 years of the world turning and unfolding, and for the rest of this to come out. But I think that there's enough on the record there. It's very interesting when you look at the people who've studied the Kennedy assassination over the decades, and many of them are dead now, but they studied it through this period of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then by the time you get to the 90s, there's an explosion of records and information. Then you get to 2003, and it's like the kibosh is on again. That's the interesting part. And then you're supposed to get all the records in 2017. Mike Pompeo convinces Trump not to release the rest. And, you know, Andrew Napolitano says, why not? And Trump says, if you knew it was in there, you couldn't release it either. This all, you know, there's something lurking in there. And the idea that, as I've heard before, that, oh, the records of the JFK assassination won't contain anything dramatic because, after all, the CIA could just black it out or get rid of it. Apparently, and I've opened this up in documentaries and on different specials and things. Look, Robert Kennedy had a meeting 4 hours after the assassination at his farm in Virginia with the head of the CIA. And he said to him, you know, this is how you're going to do the filing system of your records and everyone who was involved in and under your command, basically. Something in what Robert Kennedy instructed him made it impossible for them to blot out the record. So there's this indication that Bobby booby-trapped their ability to white themselves out of this story. So there is, you know, there's all kinds of blackmail that exists on either side in relation to these things. But I somehow feel that Bobby put in a booby trap that if they try to lift something out of the files, it would set off all these bells and whistles in the Justice Department. That's the factor that's missed in that conversation when people say there's nothing in those records. Obviously, there's something in those records for them to hold on to them for dear life for 61 years. So there's no question that there are. The question is, can you get those records released? And this is what we're going to find out, because Kennedy and Trump have pledged to do it, and it ties directly into all the reporting that we've seen here on this tonight. Now, I will say this, that not included in the records are the files of George Joannidis, which is part of a separate lawsuit that was filed by Jefferson Morley, the former Washington Post journalist who found out about Joannidis creating the brainstorm of the PSYOP of the Oswald PSYOP. Now, Joannidis, as I've pointed out, got his Lifetime Achievement Medal from Bobby Inman, who went on the record, even though he was, assistant CIA director, and said, oh no, not only do we know what UFOs are, we know who's operating them in the craft. That's a statement he gave to Timothy Good. So there's no backtracking on that. Bobby Inman's still alive. You could put him under oath congressionally to get those kinds of answers. You might want to hurry up. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to take 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up episode of the X series 185, the JFK coup. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to bundle these. David Truman, it seems like LBJ had a psyche crushed, not just by the murders, but by the whole affair of selling out to the Nazi occult ambitions, the ruling the world from space, the breakaway civilization. And Najat Madri, will the real discussion of Nazis infiltrating our government ever happen?
Well, there's a post-Nazi, that whole thing. That group, we brought them over, and the paperclip story we started to understand it. It started to be really, I'd say sometime in the 1990s, they started to, it started to become a regular topic of research. There were researchers who came across it earlier, but that influence, that kind of martial philosophy involved, we see in a number of things, from the pharmaceutical cult to the neocons. So certainly it's a factor. And the advanced technology aspect involved with the post-Nazi group, whenever you're getting around questions of who's flying these things, and what's going on with massive UFO sightings and things of that nature, and then the drone aspect, and then the advanced technology there, you have to, when you track back on some of this, you have to conclude that it is that influence of Nazi advanced technology and the space program that is the secretive piece there that was so problematic for Kennedy being in office and wanting transparency. So those things are linked. Now, no one should think that the UFO stuff is just some Nazi tech. I don't believe that at all, because I think it's a lot older. But the idea that it's an off-world civilization has to be part of the equation of thinking it out. But I think there's an overemphasis on the off-world aspect, but I don't think it should be lost in sorting out, how that level of amazing technology, when it shows up in our space, what is it that's happening? And remember, for me, the apotheum effect is something that makes the UFO experience indistinguishable from kind of like, say, Nikola Tesla X technology. So the UFO file then holds the X technology. So, they seem to have the same exact effects, and when you get around the UFO file, what are those effects? When you lose time, so apotheum is like reality distortion. The regular laws of physics don't apply. So the abductees, I still remember being a 19-year-old kid and having John Mack say to me, oh yeah, the abductees are taken through the wall. That's pretty interesting. I thought to myself then. Now I really think it's interesting. How do you pull somebody through a wall? So you have to completely eliminate the regular physics that we're used to. And so apotheum, all sorts of things happen when those major sightings happen. If you read the cases that John Keel gives us, there are other factors like lightning that show up in relation to UFO waves as well. So that's the direction I would go, I guess, with a question like that, which is the apothegm piece is what they're hiding in the middle of all that, because I think it's unpredictable and it's a complete reality distortion. So it's very hard to aim, as it were. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question of the
I'm
night.
give it to Boober Fighter. Trump could be bluffing, but the deep state is so worried about it that it proves they don't have a tight ship, which implies that other people might have the same information outside of the deep state. The deep state is definitely insecure about the power that they have at this point.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. And, I'll say this too, which is when LBJ didn't get in, D.H. Byrd made a comment that we may have lost the battle, but we'll win the war. So they probably won the war when they assassinated President Kennedy. So in this case, I think with Trump coming in, the deep state lost the battle, but they want to win the war. So, that's the thing to keep in mind. And I don't think there should be any irrational exuberance about Trump getting in, but the alternative would have been so devastating. And so we're so lucky, I think, to have this taking place, the inauguration on Monday of President Trump with Vice President Vance and Bobby Kennedy as HHS Secretary and Kash Patel at FBI, Ratcliffe at CIA, Tulsi Gabbard as DNI. That's a cleanup operation. And that is a totally different kind of government. Make no mistake about it. Now, I want to kind of summarize and say this in relation to Billy Sol Estes. I think that Sol Estes was a big risk taker, a swindler, and a wheeler dealer that had made all this money. And but I do feel that fundamentally that he felt LBJ hung him out to dry for crimes that they actually both committed after all. So the fact that we get these things through Sol Estes about Mac Wallace being involved in the assassination and LBJ being a part of the assassination, I think that we're getting a very high level of information from Sol Estes on that. And he worked and was an intimate, close business associate of LBJ's. He knew the secrets and he knew where the bodies were buried. And I think at the end of the day, he felt like he lost a big chunk of his life because LBJ didn't go the extra mile for him. And I think this is now why we get this incredible revelation off the record. I also think that there are more revelations that the stealth archives of Billy Sol Estes are hanging out there. And I think we will hear more on this story. But I think there is a kind of actionable evidence involved in the tape that Shane Stevens gave to us, who's the grandson of Sol Estes. And with that, Miss Olivia, we are done.
All right. So let me thank Occult Fan, Jonathan McIntosh, Eurythmia's Fun, Jessica Rodriguez, Empire of Light, Brian Whitaker, Descat Rock, Thomas Ball, The Bikini Truther, Astara, Ray Story, Amarillo Gunrunners, Just a Girl, Mark Lingerfelt, Brian Berner, Nightline Legal, Terry Doherty, Smuggler Ride, Erica Swenson Elliott, Carolyn E., Roosevelt Media News, CC, Jake, Babar J. Provolone, and Harvardian. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Oh, we really appreciate your support. And to all our subscribers, thank you. We couldn't do the work that we do without you. And we'll bring as much of the story forward as we can. I wanted to give you a glimpse of a Ling Temco Vout stock certificate. This certificate is transferable in the city of New York. All right, if you want to send me that $100,000 worth of Ling Temco Vout, or maybe that's worth $100 million. Watch out.
I just want to point out that on that logo, on that design,
oh yes, there's
an observatory.
There's an observatory in the back there, and he's obviously like, some kind of a He looks like he's a Roman god of some kind.
He looks like Charlton Heston.
He's got a very interesting globe there, no question about it. LTV, we've covered them on a number of occasions. They were one of the first companies that Professor Scott pointed out to me as achieving a financial benefit that was traceable after the Kennedy assassination. And I think that their story is definitely part of this advanced aerospace story operating in the background. And the fact that you have Byrd, D.H. Byrd, right on the top of it, that means that when Lee Harvey Oswald, who said he's going to work for NASA after all, shows up at the Texas School Book Depository, he's working for an experimental aerospace company. So is Mac Wallace. So those things have to figure into our equations here. And I'm going to do, bravo, Miss Olivia, nicely done. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs here, but whew, you got it. X Series 185. And the timing was just too perfect with the Alex revelation. That's just great. And great work on Alex's behalf, who, after all, has been doing a lot of research over 30 years on the Kennedy assassination, and has brought forward incredible things on that. You know, it's also interesting, and I've noticed this, people in Texas, they understand the assassination better, and because it's on the ground. And also what's interesting is the amount of agriculture people involved and agricultural forces that are involved in the assassination. All of this, you know, all of the Billy Celeste's story is an agricultural story. And the person that they bumped off and put themselves on the radar with was Henry Marshall, who was an agricultural official. So, you know, there's agriculture in this story. You have to understand the forces that are involved. There's aerospace and there's agriculture. Darcy Edmonds, it's great to have you out there. Jonathan McIntosh. Oh, yeah. Fubar Fighter says, Vout F4U Corsair, undoubtedly a fine LTV product. I did a lot of tracking about what happened to LTV. Quite interesting indeed. To be continued. Kevin Bauman, Scarlet Fire. Professor Hamamoto. What is that? Oh, yes. ECAMINE, the land grant college's agricultural schools. Examine. Yes, okay. I thought it was, we had an examen term there. That's a good one. I will do. Land grant colleges to AG schools. Thank you. Alchemy by Angela. We've got prayers for Monday to go smoothly and for us to arrive there without a hitch. Yeah, they moved the inauguration indoors. Quite interesting indeed. I think it was a good move, real good move. And I think it was directly drone related.
I didn't get to ask you this question, but
Yeah.
sort of Peter Nuss says, what is DJ's take on Greer releasing 70 whistleblowers on the UFO files next week publicly? Somebody else said he's doing something tomorrow.
Yeah, there's a thing, the egg stories coming out tomorrow. I think that there's a big rush on, and most of it is highly unsavory. Around the UFO file piece. And, you know, whenever I hear, oh, they're all going to come out now, that's tough, you know. But whatever comes out, we can assess it. And I do think that they're going to try some improved product. I'll put it to you that way. I think you're going to get a film that's going to look pretty convincing. And maybe it'll be the egg one, maybe it's another one. But they're going to be putting out a higher quality Stanley Kubrick style product, you know. But unfortunately, I don't think they're going to give us anything legitimate, because I don't think they want us to know what the legitimate side is at all. I just think that they want this to build up a UFO defense office per Chris Mellon, per Peter Thiel. Yes, LBJ was a main player in agriculture. Yes, indeed. What else we got here? Wolfgang McCarthy. Monday is going to be good. Yes. The The mobster full, noon improved. Woke goes up in smoke. I like that. Who said that? Copernicus. I like it. Excellent. Great name, too. Caritas Tarot. Everyone who feels it, please call for angelic intervention on behalf of humanity to protect all aspects of inaugural proceedings. Deep breath. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. You know, I think it's a good, there's some kind of planetary alignment where all the planets align right after that. So I think we're in good shape. I think we got a reprieve from whatever these people were up to, but we'll see what we'll see about winning the battle versus winning the war. We're just getting rolling, Najat.
On that note, I want to throw this in there. I have zero idea how to pronounce this. Wayatoya Sheik, I guess. Why is Congress meeting for an intelligence issue at midnight on the 20th, according to their website?
Well, it's interesting. You want to send it to me? It's admin@darkjournalist.com. I'll take a look at that. It is interesting. Late night is always a little bit disturbing for those types of meetings. Great show, DJ and Olivia, says Bardo. Thank you very much. Rest in peace, Lynch. Yeah, you know, I cannot express to you the amount of artistry involved in Lynch's work. Of course, most of you already know, but from my point of view, and that's the kind of thing that we need. We need that artistry that presses the boundary, and those artists who can be allowed, you know. And he was in a Hollywood system, I get that, but he had enough.
But he fought it.
He did, and he had enough of that freedom sense to bring us really dramatically fascinating portrayals, and so much of his work, you know. And it's not like every movie was great, no, but the ones that are great are stellar.
You know, I just want to add something about that. One of the thing that is so remarkable is that he didn't want to be understood. He never explained his art, and he wasn't.
He was big into TM too.
Yeah, well, it was, his art was so pure. It was about his relationship to his own psyche. And it wasn't about other people and getting validation from the audience and thinking, you know, wanting to be perceived as great. He was just really true to his art. And that's why he is a cut above.
And that's why the work was so good. You see the difference between lining someone up to be on a kind of cookie cutter sequel superhero thing is the disaster of Hollywood, which is why they lost the plot dramatically. But we need to get back to ideas. And, you know, I don't think artificial intelligence is it. You know, you can inspire yourself off with that. But if anything, we need a kind of a counter movement, which is maybe thoroughly unartificial intelligence. Midnight on the 20th will be a full moon void. Oh, the tide is turning. We have to be the ones who turn it all the way. That's Najad. Yeah, excellent, excellent sentiment. Wow. I agree with that. LBJ needs to go back into the void and be recycled by the prime creator. Hey, you know, Casey, if you read Casey readings, when he goes into, I'm losing my voice here at the end. When he goes into Saturn, he talks about the reincarnation cycle. And if people have really just blown it, on Earth, their matter is cast into Saturn, where it's kind of like melted down again. So Saturn is like that. There's another very, very strange thing when Casey's giving a reading, and he would have dreams while he was giving the readings. And on this dream, he's walking on the ring of Saturn, and he sees these kind of watchmen walking on that ring of Saturn, and he realizes, aha, Saturn is a maximum security prison. That's the dream. Make of that what you may, but sure is interesting, considering, you know, he gave us all the Atlantis info. Jonathan McIntosh, keep well and nourished, everyone. That's very pleasant. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Lynch, rest in peace. Yes, I agree with you. Shots and Zenjin. Esther, cat morphine. DJ, was there any connection between Manly P. Hall and Edgar Casey? Well, certainly in terms of the topics, Manly P. understood the mystery school thing very, very well. He was doing deep lectures on Atlantis. The Secret Teachings of All Ages contain most of the mystery schools. And he understood Helena Blavatsky's work and also a great deal. Did he ever comment specifically on Casey's? A good question. They certainly were contemporaries, but Manly Hall lived. I think Casey was born probably about 40 years before Manly P. Hall. It's interesting because Manly P. did his incredible work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, at the age of 27, which I found quite remarkable indeed. And one figure I will mention for those of you who stuck around for the end of the shout-outs is Ed Clark, who was one of these really hardcore figures in the middle of all this. He's the person on the LBJ side. I found he was assistant district attorney of Texas at 26. And he was the one who supposedly helped LBJ organize and, his killing spree there. And he's a very interesting character in all this. I'm not sure we understand Ed Clark, but 26 as Assistant Attorney General, that may bear some deeper investigation, along with the fact that he becomes the ambassador to Australia under LBJ's presidency.
Does that have any link to Pine Gap?
Well, it's quite a reward, but Pine Gap starts, of course, under LBJ. And that is the Australian Area 51. Make no mistake. Roosevelt, it's great to see you. Great show, DJ and Olivia. Can't wait for the gold episode. It's going to be golden. There's no question about it. Scott Russell, Thomas Bell. DJ is a glutton of information. Thank you, Thomas Ball. Great to see you. Fantastic out there. So many great questions. Wow. And that was a great run of Ideas Room information. We will be back with you next week. And let's all have a fantastic presidential inauguration weekend celebration. And then Monday have the big day when we finally lose Stepford Biden and Kamala and go into the Trump-Vance era with their great team. Let's see what happens here. Let's give them a chance. And like I said, no reporting on the Trump-Vance team is going to be worth anything until the first year plays out. So let's see what happens. Thank you, everyone. And it says end broadcast after all, but
never really ends.
It never really ends. We'll see you all next week. And the X series will return now the first Friday in February. You ready for that? I think it's February 7th.
We're going to have to go live. Come on.
No. We'll do special reports,
okay,
and we will do interviews and things, but the X series will return the first Friday in February. That is February 7th. So we'll see you then with that, and we'll see you next week with a special report. Have a great weekend, everyone.
God bless.
And never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot. And even though we lost John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, we can see the cycle coming back around. So we salute their incredible work for this country and the incredible sacrifices they made. And unfortunately, some of those sacrifices were undone by the likes of Lyndon Johnson and his crew. But let's not say that Lyndon was responsible for the entire operation. Of course, the Central Intelligence Agency and the aerospace groups were the ones, and they needed their front man. They got him in the figure of LBJ, who, shall we say, had criminal tendencies.
As Garrison would say, he's a toehold, right?
No question. No question about it. Everyone have a great night, and Camelot's back at you.